I stood in my bridal suite adjusting my veil when my sister sneered over the phone. "Do not wait for Dad. He chose to stand with me today." I whispered, asking how she could do this on my wedding day. She just laughed and told me I should have known my place. I thought I would have to walk down the aisle alone until the heavy oak doors swung open. My sister froze her eyes wide with terror, and my father could not even look up. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family member. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I am the founder of a highly successful private equity firm in Atlanta. To the outside world, my family looked like a perfect portrait of African American excellence. My father Desmond owned a logistics company that had been a staple in our community for years. My mother Yvonne spent her days organizing charity galas and ensuring our family maintained a flawless reputation among the city elite. But behind the manicured lawns and the country club memberships lay a toxic hierarchy that suffocated me my entire life. I was the older sister, the responsible one, the scapegoat. My younger sister Jasmine, who is now 32, was the undeniable golden child. Jasmine was beautiful, charismatic, and completely manipulative. She knew exactly how to play my parents to get whatever she wanted. When she dropped out of 3 different college programs, my parents paid her credit card bills and praised her for finding herself. When I graduated at the top of my class with a degree in finance, my father barely looked up from his newspaper to say that business was a tough world for a woman. My mother constantly criticized my appearance, my dedication to my career, and my lack of a husband. "You need to soften up, Kendra," she would say, while arranging flowers for one of her parties. "Men do not want a woman who acts like a general. Look at Jasmine. She knows how to make a man feel important." Jasmine had married Preston 3 years ago. Preston was a wealthy white man who was the heir to a commercial real estate firm. He was arrogant, dismissive, and constantly flaunted his family wealth. My parents worshipped him. They saw his family connections as their ultimate ticket into the highest echelons of society. They ignored his condescending remarks and the way he openly mocked my father's logistics business as a quaint little operation. I tolerated family gatherings by keeping my distance and focusing on my work. I built my firm from the ground up, working 80-hour weeks and making strategic investments that eventually made me a millionaire. But I kept my financial success completely hidden from my family. I knew exactly what would happen if they found out. Desmond would demand investments for his struggling business, and Yvonne would expect me to fund Jasmine's lavish lifestyle. Then I met Malik. Malik is 36 years old and a brilliant corporate attorney. He is strong, supportive, and fiercely protective of me. When he proposed last year, I finally felt like I was building a family of my own, based on mutual respect and genuine love. We planned a beautiful wedding at an exclusive luxury resort just outside the city. I paid for everything myself, refusing my parents' half-hearted offer to contribute a few $1,000s. I wanted the day to be perfect and free from their control, but I underestimated the depths of their toxicity and the absolute entitlement of my sister. The nightmare began on the morning of my wedding. I was in the bridal suite, adjusting the intricate lace of my veil. The room was quiet. My bridesmaids were getting their hair done in the adjoining suite, and I finally had a moment to breathe and reflect on the journey that had brought me to this day. My phone buzzed on the vanity. The screen flashed with Jasmine's name. I hesitated before answering, a familiar knot forming in my stomach. I should have ignored it, but my sense of familial obligation won out. "Hello," I answered, trying to keep my voice light. "Good morning, bride-to-be," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with that syrupy sweetness she always used right before a strike. "I just wanted to give you a quick heads up about some changes to the schedule today." "Changes?" I asked, my heart rate accelerating. "What are you talking about, Jasmine?" "The ceremony starts at 2 o'clock. "Well, yours does," she replied casually. "But Preston and I decided last night that this resort is just too beautiful to waste. We are hosting a surprise 5-year vow renewal today. And since his parents flew in all their important business partners, we figured it just made sense to do it at the exact same time as your little garden ceremony." I stared at my reflection in the mirror, unable to process the sheer audacity of her words. You are hijacking my wedding day to host a vow renewal, I asked, my voice trembling. Oh, do not be so dramatic, Kendra, she scoffed. It is not hijacking. We are just sharing the joy. Besides, you are out in the garden tent anyway. We will be inside the grand ballroom. We will not even cross paths. I gripped the edge of the vanity. The grand ballroom was supposed to be mine. I had booked it a year in advance. But what stopped my breath completely was her next sentence. Also, do not wait for Dad in the bridal suite. Jasmine continued, her tone turning sharp and victorious. He chose to stand with me today. He is going to walk me down the aisle for the renewal. Preston family is investing $5 million into Dad failing logistics company next week. So Dad knows where his priorities need to be. I felt the air leave my lungs. You are taking our father on my wedding day, I whispered, asking how she could do this. She just laughed. You should have known your place, Kendra. You always get so emotional over these things. It is just like your college graduation. Remember that. I remembered it perfectly. I had worked tirelessly to graduate with honors. The morning of the ceremony, Jasmine had a minor panic attack because she chipped a fingernail before a local beauty pageant. My father stayed behind to calm her down and missed me walking across the stage to receive my diploma. When I confronted him later, he had simply said that Jasmine was fragile and needed him while I was strong and could handle things on my own. It was the defining theme of my existence in that family. My strength was used as an excuse to abandon me. I knows I need him today, Jasmine said, bringing me back to the present. I have all of Preston VIP guests looking at me, and I need to make a perfect impression. You are just marrying a lawyer. You are strong, Kendra. You can walk yourself down the aisle. She ended the call before I could say another word. I stood in the silent bridal suite, the phone still clutched in my hand. For a moment, the familiar pain of rejection threatened to overwhelm me. The urge to break down to cry over the father who had never chosen me and the mother who enabled it all was heavy in my chest. But then I looked at my reflection in the mirror. I did not see the scared, unloved daughter they thought I was. I saw the woman who had built an empire from nothing. I saw a venture capitalist who routinely dismantled predatory corporations before breakfast. They think they still own me, I said quietly to the empty room. They think I am still the scapegoat who will just bow her head and take the abuse to keep the peace. I set the phone down and smoothed my dress. I was not going to cry. Because this betrayal was not a surprise. It was the culmination of a trap that had been set 3 days ago. 72 hours earlier, I was standing at the concierge desk in the main lobby of the resort, finalizing the vendor deposits for the grand ballroom. The resort was magnificent with towering glass windows overlooking pristine gardens and crystal-clear lakes. I had just handed the concierge my payment details when Preston swaggered up to the desk. He was wearing an expensive linen suit and that perpetual smirk that made my skin crawl. Jasmine trailed behind him, looking bored. Well, if it is not the blushing bride, Preston announced loudly enough for several passing guests to hear. Planning a wedding must be stressful when you are trying to stretch a boutique firm salary. I ignored the insult, turning back to the concierge. We are all set for Saturday, correct? I asked. The concierge nodded politely. Before he could confirm, Preston slapped a heavy platinum credit card onto the marble counter right over my paperwork. Change of plans, Preston said, directing his attention entirely to the concierge. My wife and I have decided to host a massive vow renewal this Saturday. We need the grand ballroom. You can bump her event out to the garden tent. I am sure her guests will not mind the humidity. The concierge looked uncomfortable, glancing between Preston and me. Sir, this ballroom has been reserved for over a year by this lady. I am afraid I cannot just transfer the reservation. Preston leaned forward, his face flushing red with arrogance. Do you know who my family is? We own half the commercial real estate in this district. I am telling you to move her to the tent. He turned to look at me with absolute disdain. My family firm is injecting $5 million into your father logistics company next week, Kendra. If we do not bail him out, he loses everything. Your dad already agreed you would take the outdoor tent so Jasmine can have the grand ballroom and impress our investors. Know your place, Kendra. You are lucky we are even allowing you to have your little ceremony at the same venue. Jasmine stood behind him, examining her manicure. Just be a good sister for once, Kendra. She sighed. We really need the space, and Dad said you would not mind downgrading since your wedding is so small anyway. I looked at my sister and her arrogant husband. I looked at the platinum card sitting on the counter, representing the financial power they used to control my parents. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue. I simply opened my wallet and pulled out a solid black unmarked metal card. I slid it across the marble counter to the concierge, pushing Preston Platinum card out of the way. Keep the grand ballroom under my name, I instructed the concierge, keeping my eyes locked on Preston. And go ahead and book the garden tent for Mr. Preston vow renewal. You can charge the deposit to his platinum card if it does not decline. Preston let out a harsh bark of laughter. If it declines. My card has a higher limit than your entire net worth, sweetheart. He gestured aggressively to the concierge. Run the card. Show this arrogant woman what real wealth looks like. The concierge picked up Preston Platinum card with trembling hands. He inserted it into the terminal. We all stood in silence as the machine processed the transaction. A sharp beep echoed in the quiet lobby. The concierge looked at the screen, his face paling. I am sorry, sir, he stammered, avoiding Preston's furious gaze. The card has been declined. Preston's face contorted with rage. He snatched the card from the terminal, shouting about bank errors and incompetent staff. He grabbed Jasmine by the arm and stormed out of the lobby, vowing to make me pay for humiliating him. I watched them leave, my expression perfectly neutral. Once they were out of sight, I pulled out my phone and drafted a quick text message to my wealth manager. Accelerate the acquisition of Preston Family Trust. I want to own their entire debt portfolio by Friday morning. I hit send and smiled. They had absolutely no idea what was coming. The next day, the tension in the air was palpable. I was hosting a welcome luncheon for Malik family and out-of-town guests in one of the resort private dining rooms. The atmosphere was joyful and relaxed until my parents arrived. Desmond and Yvonne marched into the room, their faces tight with barely concealed panic. They did not greet Malik's parents. They did not offer congratulations. Desmond walked straight up to me and violently grabbed my arm, pulling me into an empty side hallway away from the guests. What is wrong with you? Desmond hissed, his grip painfully tight on my arm. How dare you embarrass Preston in the lobby yesterday? Do you have any idea what you have done? I pulled my arm from his grasp, rubbing the spot where his fingers had dug into my skin. I simply paid for my venue, Dad. Preston card declined. That is not my fault. Yvonne stepped forward, her eyes blazing with that familiar brand of maternal betrayal. You are always so selfish, Kendra, she spat. You have always been jealous of Jasmine, and now you are trying to ruin her vow renewal. This is just like when you refused to co-sign the business loan for Jasmine Medical Spa. You forced us to drain your college fund to save her business, and you never let us forget it. You have always held on to that petty resentment. I stared at my mother, marveling at her ability to rewrite history. I had refused to co-sign a predatory loan for a business that had no business plan. They had chosen to steal my college tuition to fund Jasmine Vanity Project, which went bankrupt 6 months later. I had worked 3 jobs to pay my way through school, while Jasmine lived in a luxury apartment on their dime. And somehow, in their twisted reality, I was the selfish one. Preston Family is our only ticket to the country club elite. Yvonne continued, her voice rising. Their investment is the only thing saving your father logistics company from complete bankruptcy. We cannot afford to offend them. Desmond pointed a trembling finger at my face. Listen to me very carefully, Kendra. You are going to surrender the grand ballroom to Jasmine right now. You will apologize to Preston and you will take the garden tent. If you do not, I will not walk you down the aisle tomorrow. I will formally disown you and skip this wedding entirely. You will walk alone and everyone will know you are a disgrace to this family. I looked at my parents' desperate, image-obsessed faces. They were willing to destroy my wedding day, cast me aside, and publicly humiliate me, all to appease a bankrupt white man who treated them like servants. The absolute lack of love in their eyes was staggering, but it was also liberating. The last invisible thread tying me to their approval completely dissolved. Instead of fighting, I lowered my eyes and let my shoulders slump, feigning defeat. Fine, I whispered, making my voice sound broken. You can have the ballroom, I will take the tent. I just want peace. Jasmine, who had clearly been eavesdropping around the corner, stepped into the hallway. She was holding a mimosa and wearing a triumphant smirk. Good girl, she said, taking a slow sip of her drink. You always were better suited for the background anyway. Do not worry. I will make sure the ballroom looks spectacular. They turned and walked away, leaving me alone in the hallway. I could hear them laughing as they retreated, talking about floral arrangements and ice sculptures. Malik stepped out of the dining room, his brow furrowed with concern. He walked over and gently touched my shoulder. Are you okay, Maya? He asked, using his private nickname for me. I heard some of that. Are we really moving the ceremony to the garden? I turned to my brilliant, fiercely supportive fiancé. The fake sorrow vanished from my face, replaced by a deadly, calculating smile. I pulled my phone from my pocket and opened an email that had arrived just moments ago. They can have the ballroom for now, I told Malik, showing him the screen. I did not just book a venue, Malik. I just bought this entire luxury resort, because I had gracefully surrendered the grand ballroom. Jasmine and Preston decided they owned the entire weekend. That night, I was scheduled to host my rehearsal dinner at an exclusive Michelin-starred restaurant downtown. Instead of a quiet celebration with Malik family, Jasmine and Preston hijacked the event, turning it into a massive pre-party for their vow renewal. They invited dozens of Preston wealthy friends, completely taking over the main dining area. I sat quietly at the end of the table watching the spectacle unfold. Preston stood up, tapping his crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, demanding everyone's attention. He swayed slightly, clearly having enjoyed too much of the expensive scotch. I want to make a toast, Preston announced, his voice booming across the restaurant. To my beautiful wife Jasmine, and to the amazing future of our families. As you all know, my family commercial real estate firm is finalizing a massive multi-million-dollar merger with Kingsley Holdings next week. We are about to be untouchable. He paused, letting the wealthy guests applaud before turning his arrogant gaze toward me. And we also want to thank Kendra for letting us borrow this restaurant tonight. It is nice to see you taking a break from your little startup job. Not everyone can handle the big leagues, but we appreciate you trying to keep up. He chuckled, a cruel sound that echoed in the quiet room. Even Desmond begged me for a bailout last week. He literally cried in my office. But hey, that is what family is for, right? Charity. I looked at my father. Desmond's face was tight with humiliation, but he forced a laugh, raising his glass to Preston. He was too desperate for Preston money to defend his own dignity. Yvonne nodded along, smiling perfectly, masking the insult to maintain their proximity to power. It was pathetic. When the dinner finally concluded, the waiter approached the table with a leather folio containing the bill. Preston did a theatrical pat-down of his tailored jacket pockets. Oh man, he said, looking at Jasmine with fake distress. I must have left my wallet in the hotel safe. Jasmine did not miss a beat. She picked up the folio and slid the bill down the long table until it stopped right in front of me. Since you saved so much money downgrading your wedding to a garden tent, you can cover this, Kendra, she said, her voice dripping with condescension. It is $18,000. Consider it a thank you for letting Dad focus on his favorite daughter this weekend. The table grew deadly quiet. Malik shifted in his seat, ready to tear Preston apart, but I placed a calming hand on his knee. I did not argue. I did not blink. I reached into my purse, pulled out my black card, and handed it to the waiter. Please run this, I said calmly. And I need a specific corporate tax receipt brought back to the table. Preston laughed loudly. A corporate tax receipt? What are you trying to write off an $18,000 dinner for a freelance gig? Do not worry about the taxes, sweetheart. Let the big boys handle the finances. The waiter returned a few minutes later, handing me the detailed receipt. I stood up, smoothing my dress. I looked down the table at Preston, who was still smirking. I handed the receipt to Malik. File this under Kingsley Holdings Acquisitions Department, I said, my voice carrying clearly across the silent restaurant. Make sure it is deducted from the restructuring budget. Preston's arrogant smile instantly vanished. He froze his wine glass halfway to his mouth. Kingsley Holdings, he stammered, confusion replacing his bravado. What are you talking about? I did not answer him. I picked up my purse, took Malik by the hand, and walked out of the restaurant, leaving Preston sweating and my family staring in absolute bewilderment. The trap was set and the jaws were about to snap shut. 72 hours earlier, I was standing at the polished marble concierge desk in the sunlit lobby of the luxury resort. I was reviewing the final catering invoices with the events director, feeling a profound sense of peace. For the past decade, I had spent my life analyzing term sheets, tearing down distressed assets, and negotiating hostile takeovers in boardrooms across the country. But looking at the seating chart for the grand ballroom brought me a different kind of satisfaction. Malik and I were paying for every single detail of our wedding out of our own pockets. We did not take a single dime from my parents. I knew better than to invite their financial control into my marriage. The heavy glass doors of the lobby slid open, and Preston marched in. He was wearing an overly expensive linen suit that somehow managed to look sloppy, and he carried himself with the unearned confidence of a man who had never been told no. Jasmine trailed a few steps behind him, hiding behind oversized designer sunglasses and scrolling mindlessly on her phone. Preston completely ignored the other guests waiting in line and stepped directly beside me at the concierge desk. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a heavy platinum credit card, and slapped it down on the marble counter right over my floral invoices. Change of plans. Preston announced, his voice booming loudly enough to ensure several passing guests turned to look. My wife and I have decided to host a massive vow renewal this Saturday to celebrate 5 years of marriage. We are going to need the grand ballroom. You can bump her event out to the outdoor garden tent. I am sure her guests will not mind the humidity. The events director looked incredibly uncomfortable. He glanced between the platinum card and my face. Sir, this ballroom has been reserved for over a year by this bride. I am afraid I cannot simply transfer a reservation, especially this close to the date. Preston leaned forward, his face flushing red with sudden arrogance. Do you have any idea who my family is? He demanded. We own half the commercial real estate in this district. I am telling you to move her to the tent. He then turned slowly to look at me, his lips curling into a condescending sneer. Let us not play games, Kendra. Your father and I had a very long chat this morning. He told me your little ceremony could easily fit in the garden tent. My family firm is injecting $5 million into his sinking ship of a logistics company next week. We are literally keeping the roof over your parents' heads and paying for your father country club dues. So when I say my wife gets the grand ballroom to impress our investors, your father agrees. You need to know your place, Kendra. You are lucky we are even allowing you to have your little ceremony at the same venue. Jasmine finally looked up from her phone, stepping up beside her husband. Just be a good sister for once, Kendra. She sighed, sounding immensely inconvenienced by my mere presence. We really need the space for Preston VIP guests. Dad already said you would not mind downgrading since your wedding is so small and budget-friendly anyway. I stared at my sister and her arrogant husband. My father had sold my wedding venue to buy another month of relevance. He had traded my joy to appease a mediocre man born on third base. I remembered being 16 when Desmond emptied my college savings account to buy Jasmine a luxury car because she refused to ride the bus. I remembered the countless times Yvonne made me forfeit my achievements so Jasmine could shine. The pattern had never changed. Desmond was still offering me up as a sacrificial lamb, but this time it was to secure his proximity to Preston white privilege and wealth. They truly believed I was just a struggling employee at some nameless startup. They had no idea that my venture capital firm managed billions in private equity. They had no idea, because I had learned long ago that sharing my success with my family only made me a target for their financial extraction. I did not raise my voice. I did not cry. I did not try to argue with a man whose entire identity was funded by his grandfather trust fund. I simply opened my clutch and pulled out a solid black unmarked metal card. It was an invitation-only account, given strictly to high net worth individuals. I slid it across the cool marble counter, pushing Preston Platinum card out of the way. Keep the grand ballroom under my name, I instructed the events director, keeping my voice dangerously calm and perfectly level. Please charge the remaining balance in full, and go ahead and book the garden tent for Mr. Preston vow renewal. You can charge the deposit to his platinum card if it does not decline. Preston let out a harsh, mocking bark of laughter. If it declines, he repeated, shaking his head in disbelief. My card has a higher limit than your entire net worth, sweetheart. He gestured aggressively toward the events director. Run the card. Show this arrogant woman what real wealth looks like. The events director picked up Preston's platinum card with trembling hands. He inserted the chip into the payment terminal. We all stood in utter silence as the machine processed the transaction. The seconds stretched out, feeling like hours in the quiet lobby. A sharp error beep echoed from the machine. The events director looked at the screen, his face draining of color. I am sorry, sir, he stammered, avoiding Preston's furious gaze. The card has been declined. Preston's face contorted with rage. He snatched the card from the terminal, shouting that the machine was broken. He pulled another card from his wallet and shoved it at the director, demanding he run it again. That machine beeped with the exact same error. Declined. Jasmine took a step back, looking around the lobby to see if anyone was watching them. Her face was flushed with deep humiliation as a few resort staff members averted their eyes. This is a bank error, Preston yelled, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. Fraud protection locks my account sometimes because of the massive transactions I make. Do you hear me? I have millions in liquidity. I looked at him, feeling a cold wave of satisfaction wash over me. Your cards are maxed out, Preston, I said smoothly, retrieving my own receipt from the director. Maybe you should spend less time worrying about my place and more time reviewing your family balance sheets. Preston stepped toward me, his fists clenched at his sides. Listen to me, you pathetic little nobody, he hissed. I am going to destroy your wedding. And when I pull my family $5 million from your father company, I am going to make sure Desmond knows it was your fault he went bankrupt. You are going to regret disrespecting me. He grabbed Jasmine by the arm and stormed out of the lobby, screaming into his cell phone at some unfortunate bank representative. Jasmine stumbled behind him, her designer heels clicking frantically against the floor as she tried to keep up. I stood at the desk and watched them disappear through the glass doors. I felt absolutely nothing for them. No pity, no fear, just the clinical detachment of a predator observing its prey. I pulled out my phone and drafted a quick message to my wealth manager. Accelerate the acquisition of Preston Family Trust. I know their commercial real estate portfolio is over-leveraged and bleeding cash. Buy their debt quietly. I want to own them by Friday morning. I hit send and locked my screen. The trap was set. They thought they held all the power because they held Desmond by the throat. But they were about to learn that I was the one holding the guillotine. I gathered my paperwork and walked out of the lobby, completely ready for the war my family was about to bring to my doorstep. Friday afternoon arrived with a suffocating heat, but inside the private dining room of the resort, the air conditioning was turned up to a freezing chill. I was hosting the welcome luncheon for our wedding guests. The room was filled with the sounds of genuine laughter and clinking glasses. Malik family had flown in from Chicago, and they brought a warmth that completely transformed the sterile luxury of the space. Malik's mother Patricia was holding both of my hands, telling me how beautiful I looked and how excited she was to officially welcome me into their family. For a fleeting moment, I allowed myself to relax. I let my guard down, believing that the humiliation I handed Preston in the lobby the day before had bought me a temporary truce. I was wrong. The heavy mahogany doors of the private dining room swung open, and my parents walked in. They did not look like the parents of the bride. They looked like executioners. Desmond's face was set in a rigid, furious mask. Yvonne walked rigidly beside him, her designer dress perfectly pressed, but her eyes darting around the room with manic energy. They did not stop to greet the guests. They did not even acknowledge Malik, who was standing near the bar. They made a straight line directly for me. Patricia was in the middle of a story about Malik's childhood when Desmond stopped right behind me. He did not say excuse me. He did not introduce himself to my future mother-in-law. He simply reached out and clamped his large hand around my upper arm. His fingers dug into my flesh with a punishing, bruising force. We need to speak to you, Kendra, Desmond said, his voice low and tight with barely controlled rage. Right now. Patricia stopped talking, her warm smile faltering as she looked at my father grip on my arm. She stepped forward slightly, her maternal instincts clearly triggered by the aggression radiating from my parents. Is everything all right, Desmond? She asked politely but firmly. This is family business, Yvonne snapped, cutting Patricia off completely. It does not concern you. Before I could reassure Patricia or call out to Malik, my father yanked me backward. The force of his pull nearly made me stumble in my heels. He dragged me away from the elegant tables and the shocked faces of my future in-laws. He practically marched me across the dining room and shoved me through a set of double doors that led into an empty service corridor. Yvonne followed close behind us, letting the doors slam shut to cut off the music and the chatter of the luncheon. The service corridor was stark and narrow. The moment the doors closed, Desmond spun me around and pinned me against the cold wall. His face was inches from mine, and I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath mixed with the sour scent of pure panic. Are you out of your mind? Desmond practically spit the words at me. What is wrong with you? How dare you humiliate Preston in the main lobby like that? Do you have any idea what you have done? I stood my ground, refusing to rub my arm where his fingers had left red marks. I did not humiliate him, Dad, I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. I simply paid for my own wedding venue. His credit card declined. That is a matter between him and his bank. Desmond slammed his hand against the wall right next to my head. You do not talk back to me, he shouted, his voice echoing in the narrow hallway. You are going to ruin everything. You know exactly what is at stake here. Preston family is the only thing keeping us afloat. My logistics company is drowning Kendra. We are weeks away from declaring bankruptcy. Preston father promised me a $5 million cash injection next week. That money is our only ticket to saving the business and keeping our country club memberships. Do you expect your mother to show her face in this city if we lose our status? I stared at him in absolute disgust. You are willing to sell my wedding day to save your country club dues, I asked. You are letting Jasmine hijack the venue I paid for just so you can play pretend with a bankrupt white family. Yvonne stepped forward, her eyes blazing with that familiar toxic venom she reserved only for me. Do not you dare speak to your father that way, she hissed. You have always been so utterly selfish, Kendra. You only ever think about yourself. You have been jealous of Jasmine since the day she was born, and now you are trying to sabotage her vow renewal just to be petty. I let out a harsh, bitter laugh. I am selfish, I asked. You are standing here demanding I surrender my wedding venue to the sister who has never worked a day in her life, and you call me selfish. You are, Yvonne yelled, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. You are exactly the same selfish little girl you were 5 years ago. Just like when you refused to co-sign the business loan for Jasmine Boutique. She needed that medical spa to establish herself, and you coldly refused to help your own flesh and blood. You forced us to drain your entire college fund just to save her dream. We had to sacrifice your education because you were too greedy to put your name on a simple piece of paper. The sheer audacity of her revisionist history made my blood run cold. A simple piece of paper, I repeated, my voice dropping to a whisper. It was a predatory loan for a business that had no financial model and no revenue projections. I refused to ruin my credit for her vanity project. And you did not sacrifice my education, Mother. You stole it. You drained the account my grandmother left for me, and you gave it to Jasmine. She bankrupted that spa in 6 months, and I had to work 3 jobs to pay my own way through finance school. I bled myself dry while she lived in a luxury apartment that you paid for. That is in the past, Desmond barked, waving his hand as if he could simply erase decades of financial abuse. Jasmine was fragile. She needed our support. You have always been tough, Kendra. You can handle hardship. Jasmine cannot. And right now, Jasmine needs the grand ballroom to impress Preston investors. I looked back and forth between the two people who were supposed to love me and protect me. They were completely unhinged, driven by their desperate need to maintain a facade of wealth that had crumbled years ago. They did not see me as a daughter. They only saw me as an obstacle to Jasmine's happiness and a threat to their social survival. So this is it, I said. You are actually going to force me out of my own wedding venue. Desmond stepped closer, his chest puffed out as he delivered his final crushing blow. I am not forcing you to do anything, Kendra. I am giving you a choice. He pointed a finger directly at my face. You are going to march back out there, and you are going to call Preston. You will publicly apologize to him for the misunderstanding in the lobby. You will formally surrender the grand ballroom to Jasmine for her vow renewal, and you will accept the outdoor garden tent for your little ceremony. And if I refuse, I challenged, holding his gaze. Desmond's eyes turned completely cold, devoid of any paternal warmth. If you refuse, I will formally disown you today. I will not walk you down the aisle tomorrow. Your mother and I will pack our bags, and we will skip your wedding entirely. You will walk down that aisle completely alone in front of Malik's entire family. Everyone will see that you are a disgrace to us. You will have no family left, Kendra. Make your choice. He glared at me, waiting for the tears he was so used to extracting from me. He waited for me to crumble, to beg for his love, to sacrifice my dignity, just to keep the peace. Yvonne stood beside him, her arms crossed, looking at me with pure contempt. They thought they held the ultimate trump card. They thought the threat of walking down the aisle alone would break me. I looked at my father and felt a strange, absolute calm settle over my entire body. I did not cry. I did not scream. I just stared at him, knowing that he had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them all. I did not say a word. I just turned around, pushed open the heavy service doors, and walked back into the bright, joyful dining room, leaving them standing in the shadows of the hallway. I knew exactly what my choice was, and it was going to cost them everything. Desmond and Yvonne scrambled out of the service hallway right on my heels, their heavy footsteps echoing against the polished marble floor. Desmond grabbed my elbow again, spinning me around before I could rejoin Malik and his family in the bright dining room. He was sweating profusely and his breathing was ragged. He demanded my answer right then and there, pinning me with a look of pure desperation. He threatened me once more, telling me that if I did not give up my wedding venue, he would walk out of the resort and leave me completely isolated on my wedding day. I looked at the two of them, taking in my father trembling hands and my mother perfectly painted face, which was stretched tight with anxiety. They were absolutely terrified of losing their precious country club status. They were terrified of being exposed as financial frauds to their wealthy friends. The irony was incredibly thick. My father was willing to sacrifice his eldest daughter to appease a man who was secretly bankrupt. He was willing to destroy my happiness to secure a $5 million investment that did not actually exist. I knew exactly how to play this game. I had survived 3 decades in this family by learning how to mask my true intentions. I let my shoulders drop forward, stripping all the defiance from my posture. I forced my eyes to well up with tears, making myself look like the broken, defeated daughter they had spent a lifetime cultivating. I let out a shaky breath and looked at the floor, playing the role of the obedient scapegoat. "Fine," I said, keeping my voice barely above a whisper. "You win, Dad. I will give up the grand ballroom. I will tell the coordinator that I will take the garden tent. Just please do not leave tomorrow. Please do not abandon me on my wedding day." The transformation on their faces was instantaneous and entirely sickening. Desmond's rigid posture completely relaxed. His chest puffed out with victorious pride, and he actually reached out and patted my head like a dog that had finally learned to roll over. "I knew you would see reason, Kendra," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "This is what family does. We make sacrifices for the greater good. You are doing the right thing for our legacy. You are finally acting like a team player." Yvonne smiled, a tight, victorious smile smoothing the front of her designer dress. "It is just a tent, Kendra," she added, dismissing my entire wedding with a wave of her hand. "You are not exactly royalty. A garden ceremony suits you perfectly. Now we can finally focus on making sure Preston parents are properly entertained. We have very important people arriving tomorrow, and we cannot afford any distractions from you." Right on cue. The heavy wooden doors swung open wider, and Jasmine strolled into the vestibule. She was holding a crystal flute filled with a bright orange mimosa and wearing a silk sundress that probably cost more than my father's weekly payroll. She had undoubtedly been standing just around the corner, listening to every single word of my humiliation. She thrived on my pain. It was her favorite source of entertainment. "Good girl," Jasmine said, taking a slow, deliberate sip of her drink. She walked up to me and looked me up and down with absolute pity. "You always were better suited for the background anyway, Kendra. The grand ballroom requires a certain type of presence, a certain type of elegance that you just do not possess. You and Malik will be much more comfortable out in the humidity with the bugs. It fits your whole struggling startup vibe perfectly. I kept my head bowed, playing my part to absolute perfection. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing right in her face. Jasmine stepped closer, leaning in so I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath. Do not worry about the ballroom, big sister, she whispered maliciously. Preston and I will make sure it looks spectacular. We are flying in custom orchids from Holland tonight. It will be the society event of the year. Yvonne laughed, a sharp glittering sound that echoed off the marble floors. Oh, do not tease your sister, Jasmine, Yvonne chided, playfully acting as if my entire wedding had not just been stolen from me. Kendra is doing us a huge favor. Let us go find Preston and tell him the good news. We need to start contacting our VIP guests immediately to let them know the vow renewal is officially in the main ballroom. I told them I needed a moment to myself and watched as the three of them linked arms and walked away toward the lobby. They were already discussing the seating charts, completely dismissing my existence the second they got exactly what they wanted. I could hear Jasmine laughing loudly about how easily I had folded. She bragged to my parents about how I never had the spine to stand up for myself, and how I was always destined to be the loser of the family. I stood alone in the vestibule for a long moment, letting the sound of their cruel laughter fade down the corridor. My fake tears dried instantly. I stood up straight, adjusting the neckline of my dress, and took a deep, steadying breath. The air suddenly felt incredibly clear. The final remnants of my childhood guilt had been completely burned away by their betrayal. I had spent years hoping they would eventually love me for who I was. But standing in that hallway, I realized they only loved what they could extract from me. I owed them absolutely nothing. Malik emerged from the dining room a few seconds later. He had seen my family walk away, and he immediately read the residual tension in my posture. He closed the distance between us, wrapping his strong, warm arms around my waist. He looked down at me, his dark eyes full of intense concern and quiet fury. He asked me what Desmond had said to me in the hallway. He asked if the rumors whispering through the resort staff were true. He wanted to know if we were really moving our ceremony to the garden tent, because Preston threw a tantrum at the concierge desk. I leaned into his embrace, soaking in his unwavering support. Malik was a brilliant attorney who fought ruthlessly for his clients, but with me, he was nothing but gentle and protective. He had offered to confront my father a dozen times over the past year, but I had always asked him to hold back. I wanted to handle my family my own way. Now it was finally time to let my future husband in on the master plan. I knew he would appreciate the precise legal execution of what I was about to do. Yes, I told him, keeping my voice perfectly steady. We are officially giving them the grand ballroom. My parents threatened to boycott the wedding entirely and disown me if I did not surrender the space to Jasmine and Preston. They chose his investment money over my wedding day. They made their choice, Malik. Malik's jaw tightened dangerously. A muscle feathered in his cheek and his eyes darkened with raw anger. He started to pull away from me, reaching into his jacket pocket for his phone. He stated firmly that he was going to call the venue manager right now. He declared that he would personally throw Preston out of the resort, and that he would not let my toxic family bully me into downgrading the most important day of our lives. He loved me too much to watch me be treated like a second-class citizen. He told me I deserved the ballroom, and he was going to make sure I got it. I caught his hand and gently stopped him from pulling out his phone. I looked up into his beautiful, angry face and I smiled. It was a deadly, calculating smile that I usually reserved for hostile corporate takeovers in the boardroom. It was the smile that made my business rivals sweat. I reached into my own clutch and pulled out my phone. I opened my highly encrypted email application and tapped on the most recent message at the top of my inbox. I held the screen up for Malik to see. They can have the ballroom for now, I told my brilliant, fiercely protective fiancé. Look at this. Malik squinted at the bright screen, reading the complex legal jargon and the digital signatures from my private equity firm. I watched his eyes scan the paragraphs detailing the immediate transfer of massive commercial assets. Because he was a corporate attorney, it only took him a few seconds to understand the sheer magnitude of the documents displayed on my phone. I watched him read the final confirmation from my senior acquisitions director. He blinked several times, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he realized exactly what he was looking at. He looked from the phone screen to my face and back to the phone again, completely stunned by the flawless execution of the deal. The anger in his eyes melted away, replaced by absolute awe and deep, profound respect for the woman he was about to marry. He realized that I had not been defeated at all. I had simply been maneuvering my enemies onto the exact battlefield I wanted them on. I just received the final confirmation email from my legal team, I whispered, stepping closer to him so no one else in the corridor could hear my secret. The wire transfers cleared 5 minutes ago. The title and deed are fully secured under Kingsley Holdings. I did not just book a venue, Malik. I just bought this entire luxury resort. And tomorrow morning my family is going to find out exactly who they have been messing with. Friday evening arrived with a suffocating sense of entitlement that completely swallowed the elegant ambiance of the Michelin-starred restaurant I had booked months in advance. Le Chateau was supposed to be the setting for an intimate rehearsal dinner. A quiet and sophisticated evening meant exclusively for Malik's family, my closest friends, and the bridal party. I had personally curated a delicate 5-course tasting menu to celebrate the joining of our two families. Instead, the private dining room had been utterly hijacked. Because I had strategically surrendered the grand ballroom earlier that afternoon, Jasmine and Preston decided that my concession was an open invitation to claim ownership over my entire wedding weekend. Without asking my permission, they had invited over 30 of Preston's wealthy country club associates and business partners, turning my carefully planned rehearsal dinner into a raucous, self-indulgent pre-party for their vow renewal. Malik and I were practically pushed to the far corner of the long mahogany table. We sat in quiet solidarity, watching the spectacle unfold before us. I sipped my sparkling water and observed my family with the clinical detachment of a venture capitalist analyzing a toxic asset. Jasmine had positioned herself at the head of the table where Malik and I were supposed to sit. She was draped in a ridiculous white sequined gown, holding court and soaking up the compliments from Preston's elite friends. My mother Yvonne sat right next to her, completely in her element, as she fawned over the uninvited guests. She was practically vibrating with desperate energy, laughing too loudly at unfunny jokes, and ensuring that everyone knew she was the mother of the woman, renewing her vows to the heir of a real estate empire. My father Desmond hovered near Preston, acting less like a proud patriarch and more like a subservient employee, desperate for his boss's approval. The waiters moved through the room with quiet professionalism, but I could see the strain on their faces. Preston had immediately scrapped my carefully selected wine pairing and demanded the sommelier bring out their most expensive bottles of vintage champagne. He ordered off menu caviar and wagyu for his side of the table, treating the Michelin-starred staff like personal servants. Every time a new bottle of Dom Perignon was popped, Preston would loudly announce how much it cost, ensuring the entire room understood the magnitude of his supposed wealth. I watched him throw back his champagne, completely oblivious to the fact that I had spent the afternoon finalizing the hostile takeover of his family's trust. He was drinking champagne he could no longer afford on a tab he had no intention of paying, and I simply let him dig his own grave. As the dessert plates were being cleared away, Preston stood up and aggressively tapped his spoon against his crystal flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the loud chatter, and the room gradually fell silent. All eyes turned to him. He swayed slightly, clearly heavily, intoxicated by both the alcohol and his own inflated ego. He adjusted the lapels of his custom suit and smiled down at Jasmine, playing the role of the devoted billionaire husband to absolute perfection. "I want to make a toast," Preston began, his voice booming across the private dining room. He did not look at me. He did not look at Malik. He spoke directly to his wealthy peers. 5 years ago, I married the most beautiful woman in Atlanta, and tomorrow we are going to celebrate that milestone in the grand ballroom of this magnificent resort. It is going to be the society event of the year, and I want to thank all of you, my closest friends and most vital business partners, for flying in to share this moment with us. We are about to embark on an incredible new chapter of wealth and prosperity, and having you all here means everything. The room erupted in polite applause. Jasmine beamed, blowing a kiss to the crowd. Preston raised a hand to quiet them down, his smirk widening as he finally turned his gaze toward my end of the table. He looked at me with an expression of performative pity, tilting his head as if addressing a wayward child. "And of course, we have to thank my sister-in-law, Kendra Preston," continued his tone, dripping with thick condescension. "Kendra, thank you so much for stepping aside and letting us use this restaurant tonight. It is really nice to see you taking a break from your little startup job to enjoy a decent meal. I know the freelance life can be tough, and planning a wedding on a budget is stressful. Honestly, giving up the grand ballroom to us and moving your little ceremony out to the garden tent was the smartest financial decision you have ever made. You could never have filled that ballroom anyway, and this way, you get to save a few pennies for your honeymoon. So cheers to Kendra for knowing her place and letting the big dogs handle the heavy lifting." A few of his friends chuckled while Malik shifted dangerously in his seat, his jaw clenching so tight I could see the muscle feathering in his cheek. I reached under the table and rested my hand on his knee, giving it a gentle squeeze. I did not break eye contact with Preston. I simply offered him a serene, completely unbothered smile. My silence seemed to irritate him because he puffed out his chest and pivoted instantly to the topic he loved most, himself. "But the vow renewal is only the second best thing we are celebrating this weekend," Preston announced, leaning heavily on the table. "As many of you know, my family's commercial real estate firm is about to finalize a massive multi-million-dollar merger next week. We are officially joining forces with Kingsley Holdings." The room went dead silent at the mention of the name. Kingsley Holdings was a legendary entity in the financial sector, a private equity juggernaut, known for its ruthless acquisitions. "That is right," Preston boasted, pointing to a few of his investors in the crowd. "Jeremiah Kingsley himself is bringing us into the fold. The man is a billionaire legend, but let us be honest, his portfolio was getting a little stale. He needed young, aggressive blood to take over his commercial division, and my family is stepping up to the plate. We are about to control the largest real estate syndicate in the Southeast. We are going to be absolutely untouchable." I took a slow sip of my water to hide my amusement. Preston was standing in a room full of people loudly bragging about a merger that did not exist. His family's firm was drowning in toxic debt and defaulting on massive loans. Kingsley Holdings was not partnering with them. Kingsley Holdings was devouring them whole. And the most beautiful part of his entire arrogant speech was that he had absolutely no idea that the silent partner and majority shareholder of Kingsley Holdings was sitting exactly 20 feet away from him, quietly drinking sparkling water. Preston laughed loudly, holding his glass high, before deciding he needed to establish his absolute dominance over the room. He turned his attention to my father, who was sitting near the center of the table holding a glass of scotch with a forced smile. "And with all this new capital flowing in, we are even finding time to do some charity work," Preston said, a cruel glint flashing in his eyes. He looked around the room, making sure everyone was listening. "You all should have seen Desmond on Tuesday. He comes into my corner office pacing around, sweating completely through his suit. He looked like a man walking to the gallows. He practically begged me for a lifeline. He told me his little trucking business was weeks away from the graveyard, and he needed $5 million just to keep the lights on." The silence in the room shifted from impressed to incredibly uncomfortable. Preston was airing my father's deepest financial failures in front of the city's most elite gossips. I watched Desmond's face. His eyes were wide with profound humiliation, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his glass. He was being publicly emasculated, stripped of his pride and exposed as a failure. "I told him," Preston continued relentlessly, "I am not running a charity, Desmond. But I looked at my beautiful wife, and I figured, what is $5 million to a guy like me? It is pocket change. So I told him I would throw a lifeline at his little truck problem just to keep my father-in-law off the streets. But hey, that is what family is for, right? We take care of the dead weight." Preston laughed, a harsh, booming sound that reverberated against the walls. I waited for my father to stand up. I waited for Desmond to throw his drink in Preston's face, to defend his dignity, to show even a single ounce of self-respect. Instead, the most tragic thing I have ever witnessed occurred. Desmond forced a loud, booming laugh. He swallowed his pride, buried his humiliation, and raised his glass to the man who had just publicly destroyed him. Thank you, son. Desmond choked out his smile, looking more like a grimace. We appreciate the support. Yvonne immediately joined in, giggling as if Preston had just told a delightful joke. She leaned over and patted Preston's arm, completely complicit in the destruction of her husband's dignity, just to ensure they remained adjacent to his supposed wealth. They were so desperate to maintain their country club facade that they were willing to let this man walk all over them. I felt a brief, fleeting flash of pity for my parents, but it evaporated instantly. They had chosen this path. They had chosen Preston's fake gold over my genuine love, and they were paying the price. The extravagant dinner finally began to wind down. The waiters efficiently cleared the dessert plates and replaced the champagne flutes with after-dinner espresso. The heavy oak doors of the private room opened, and the restaurant's general manager walked in carrying a thick black leather folio. Because Preston had stood at the head of the table ordering off menu items and acting as the grand host for the entire evening, the manager naturally approached him. He placed the leather folio softly on the table, right next to Preston's elbow, and offered a polite bow before stepping away. The room grew quiet as the guests prepared for the night to end. Preston casually flipped open the leather cover to glance at the damage. I watched his eyes lock onto the final number. It was an astronomical figure inflated by his endless demands for vintage champagne and imported caviar. Preston stared at the receipt for a long moment, and then the performance began. He let out a loud, exaggerated sigh and patted the breast pocket of his tailored jacket. He frowned, digging his hands into his trousers and patting his back pockets with theatrical distress. He looked over at Jasmine with an expression of manufactured panic. "Oh man, you have got to be kidding me!" Preston announced, his voice carrying perfectly across the silent room. He shook his head, looking apologetically at his wealthy friends. "I cannot believe this. I was at the pool earlier and I left my wallet in the hotel safe. I do not have my cards on me. What an absolute nightmare." He did not look embarrassed. He looked incredibly proud of his own terrible acting. He slowly lifted his eyes and looked directly down the length of the mahogany table, locking his gaze onto mine. The silence in the private dining room stretched until it became a physical weight, pressing down on the shoulders of everyone present. Preston stood at the head of the mahogany table, patting down his bespoke Italian suit jacket with exaggerated clownish movements. He dug his hands into his tailored trousers, pulling the pockets inside out to show the pristine empty lining. He was performing for his audience of wealthy country club associates, turning his deliberate refusal to pay into a theatrical comedy routine. He had orchestrated this entire night, hijacked my rehearsal dinner, ordered the most expensive items off the menu, and was now expecting me to foot the bill. The general manager stood frozen, the thick black leather folio resting on the table. He looked from Preston's empty pockets to the uncomfortable faces of the resort staff lining the walls. No one moved. No one spoke. Jasmine let out a delicate musical sigh that cut through the tension. She reached out with a perfectly manicured hand, her heavy diamond engagement ring catching the light of the crystal chandeliers, and pulled the leather folio toward her. She did not even bother to look at the itemized list. She already knew it was an astronomical figure. With a slow, deliberate push, she sent the folio sliding down the center of the long table. It glided over the polished wood, passing by half-empty bottles of vintage Dom Perignon and plates smeared with the remnants of imported caviar, until it came to a halt directly in front of my plate. "Since you saved so much money downgrading your wedding to a tent, you can cover this," Jasmine said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and offering me a look of absolute triumph. "Consider it a thank you for letting Dad focus on his favorite daughter." A low murmur rippled through Preston's uninvited guests. A few of the men chuckled, nudging each other at the sheer audacity of the move. I looked past the folio and locked eyes with my parents. I expected at least a flicker of shame, a momentary hesitation at watching their eldest daughter be financially extorted on the eve of her wedding. Instead, Desmond simply raised his glass of scotch, taking a long, slow sip while staring at the wall. Yvonne actually nodded, her lips curving into a tight, approving smile. In their twisted reality, Jasmine was merely asserting her rightful dominance, and I was fulfilling my lifelong purpose as the family shock absorber. Malik shifted beside me. The heat radiating from his body was palpable. His hand clamped down on the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white. He was seconds away from tearing the room apart, ready to throw the folio back at Preston and march my family out of the restaurant by force. I reached under the table and placed my hand firmly over his knee, applying just enough pressure to anchor him. I turned my head slightly, catching his eye. I gave him a single, barely perceptible nod. Let them dig the grave deeper, my eyes promised him. I have the shovel. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or defend my honor. I did not give Jasmine the satisfaction of a reaction, nor did I provide Preston with the dramatic outburst he was so desperately trying to provoke. I simply picked up the leather folio and opened it. The final total was printed in bold black ink, $25, $450. It was a staggering amount of money for a single dinner, a sum that would have bankrupted the average family. Preston had intentionally tried to bleed me dry, assuming that a bill this large would force me to publicly admit I could not afford it, thereby completing my humiliation in front of his elite circle. Without a word, I opened my clutch and withdrew the same solid black unmarked metal card I had used in the lobby the day before. I placed it onto the silver tray inside the folio. I looked up at the general manager, who had hurried over to my side of the table looking incredibly apologetic. Please run this for the full amount, I instructed, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. And I need you to do me a specific favor. When you bring the receipt, I need an explicitly detailed corporate tax invoice. Ensure the business identification numbers are clearly marked. The manager bowed deeply, expressing his gratitude with a hushed voice before rushing out of the room to process the transaction. Preston threw his head back and let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He clapped his hands together, pointing down the table at me, as if I were the punchline to an incredible joke. A corporate tax receipt, Preston practically shouted, wiping a fake tear from his eye. Oh, that is rich. You hear that, guys? Kendra needs to write off this dinner for her little freelance gig. What are you going to categorize this under? Sweetheart, office supplies, client entertainment for your little startup. The sycophantic laughter from his country club friends swelled, filling the room with ugly, arrogant noise. I mean, I get it. Preston continued, pacing behind his chair and playing to the crowd. When you are hustling from paycheck to paycheck, you have to find those loopholes. You have to scrape every tax deduction you can just to keep the lights on. It is cute, really. It shows initiative. Maybe when my family's merger is complete, I can hire you to run our social media accounts, give you a real steady paycheck so you don't have to panic over a dinner bill. Jasmine giggled, leaning into Yvonne. She always was so dramatic about money, Jasmine stage whispered loud enough for half the room to hear. Acting like she's a CEO, just because she registered an LLC online. I sat in perfect, motionless silence. I let the mockery wash over me, absorbing every insult, every condescending laugh, every cruel remark. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced of their superiority, that they could not see the massive shadow of the guillotine hanging directly over their necks. They believed wealth was loud. They believed power was standing at the head of a table and making others feel small. They had no idea that real power was quiet. Real power was owning the table, the restaurant, and the ground they were standing on. The doors opened and the general manager returned. The room quieted slightly as he approached my seat. He carried a silver tray holding my heavy black card and two pristine printed receipts. He did not look at Preston. He looked only at me, offering a deep, respectful nod as he presented the tray. The transaction was approved instantly, ma'am, the manager said quietly, though his words carried a distinct weight. And the corporate tax invoice has been prepared exactly to your specifications. Thank you for your patronage. I picked up the black card and slipped it back into my clutch. Then I picked up the detailed corporate receipt. It was a long, itemized list of Preston's gluttony, the vintage champagne, the imported wagyu, the caviar. I did not even look at the total again. I simply turned slightly in my chair and held the piece of paper out to Malik. The dining room was hushed, now the guests watching with collective curiosity. They expected me to tuck the receipt away, to shrink back into the shadows and lick my wounds. Instead, I kept my hand extended toward my fiancé. I looked past Malik, locking my gaze directly onto Preston, who was standing at the head of the table with his arms crossed and a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. File this under Kingsley Holdings Acquisitions Department, I said. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, chilling authority of a predator snapping the trap shut. I made sure my enunciation was flawless, ensuring that the name echoed off the mahogany panels and the crystal chandeliers. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The smug grin on Preston's face vanished instantly, wiped away as if struck by a physical blow. His arms dropped to his sides. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly gray pallor. His eyes widened, darting from the receipt in my hand to my face, his brain scrambling to process the impossibility of what I had just said. Kingsley Holdings, the very same legendary private equity firm he had just spent 10 minutes bragging about. The firm he claimed was merging with his family's failing real estate empire. The firm he thought was his salvation. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A collective gasp rippled through his table of investors, the wealthy men who actually understood the gravity of that corporate name. They stared at me, their expressions shifting from condescending amusement to stark, unfiltered terror. "Kate Kingsley!" Preston stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its previous booming arrogance. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table to steady himself. A sheen of nervous sweat suddenly broke out across his forehead. "Wait, what do you mean, Kingsley Holdings? How do you—" I did not give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I did not stay to answer his panicked questions or watch him drown in his sudden realization. I smoothly stood up from my chair, smoothing the skirt of my dress. Malik stood instantly beside me, his broad shoulders squared, a slow, predatory smile finally spreading across his handsome face. He took the receipt from my hand and tucked it neatly into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. Without another word, without looking at my parents or Jasmine, I turned my back on the entire room. Malik placed a protective, warm hand on the small of my back, and together we walked toward the heavy oak doors. Behind me, the silence of the room was broken only by the sound of Preston's ragged, panicked breathing. We stepped out of the private dining room and into the cool, quiet hallway, leaving the heir to a crumbling empire sweating under the crushing weight of his impending ruin. Saturday morning broke with a brilliant, blinding sunlight that pierced through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my bridal suite. The air conditioning hummed a steady rhythm, attempting to hold back the oppressive tropical humidity outside. Today was my wedding day. I stood near the balcony sipping a cup of black coffee and looking out over the manicured resort grounds. The pristine white garden tent was being erected near the botanical gardens, exactly where my father had banished me. In the distance, I could see the staff rushing around the grand ballroom, prepping the space I had bought and paid for. My phone vibrated on the glass table. I did not even have to look at the caller identification to know who was interrupting my morning peace. I swiped the screen and lifted the phone to my ear. Jasmine did not bother with a greeting. Her voice was breathy and fast, vibrating with that familiar toxic excitement she always got when she felt she had won a victory over me. "Change of plans, little sister," Jasmine chirped over the line. "I know the schedule said Dad was coming to your suite at 10 to take pictures and walk you down to the garden, but he is actually going to be with me instead. Preston and I decided that we want a grand entrance for our vow renewal. Since Dad missed out on doing it right the first time around because we eloped, we figured he deserves to walk me down the aisle in the main ballroom today. It is going to be spectacular for the photographers." I took a slow sip of my coffee. I could hear the rustling of garment bags and the chatter of makeup artists in the background on her end. She was waiting for me to scream. She was waiting for me to cry and beg for my father to participate in my actual wedding rather than her staged publicity stunt. "That makes perfect sense, Jasmine," I replied, my voice completely devoid of emotion. "Have a wonderful morning." I ended the call before she could utter another syllable. I set the phone down and walked away from the balcony. I felt a strange, hollow sensation in my chest, but it was not grief. It was the absolute finality of my detachment. Desmond had made his choice. He had willingly surrendered the most sacred duty of a father on his daughter's wedding day to play a supporting role in Preston's pathetic circus. I walked down the short hallway of the massive suite toward the master bedroom, where the resort staff had hung my wedding dress the night before. I pushed open the heavy double doors expecting to see the white silk catching the morning light. Instead, I stopped dead in my tracks. The dress hung on the custom velvet mannequin in the center of the room, but it was no longer a dress. It was a butchered, shredded carcass of fabric. Someone had taken a pair of heavy fabric shears and violently slashed their way through the bodice and the skirt. Long, jagged ribbons of white silk spilled onto the hardwood floor like intestines. The delicate lace applique on the neckline had been ripped entirely off and left in a crumpled heap near the closet door. The sheer tulle train was completely destroyed, hacked into dozens of uneven, jagged pieces. It was not just an act of vandalism. It was a deeply personal physical manifestation of pure, unadulterated hatred. Pinned directly into the chest of the ruined mannequin was a thick piece of hotel stationery. I walked forward, my heels making soft thuds against the floor. I pulled the pin out and stared at the familiar loopy handwriting. Oops, an accident. But hey, a garden wedding is casual anyway. I stared at the note, feeling the heavy cardstock between my fingers. Jasmine had actually sneaked into my suite, or bribed a maid to let her in. She had stood in this room with a pair of scissors and violently destroyed what she believed was my wedding gown. She wanted me to walk down the aisle looking like a beggar. She wanted to ensure that when I stood next to Malik, I felt completely inadequate and utterly broken. The suite door clicked open behind me, followed by the sharp, unmistakable sound of my mother's designer heels hitting the floor. Yvonne marched into the bedroom carrying a garment bag from a high-end boutique. She stopped near the edge of the bed, and her eyes landed on the shredded remains of the dress hanging on the mannequin. I watched my mother closely. I waited for the maternal gasp of horror. I waited for her to drop the bag and rush over to me to ask what monster had done this to her daughter on her wedding day. I waited for a reaction that any normal mother would have. Yvonne simply sighed loudly, letting her shoulders drop in profound irritation. "Well, that is just unfortunate," she said, her voice completely flat. She walked over to the bed and carefully laid down her garment bag, ensuring the expensive fabric inside did not wrinkle. She did not even look at me. She just stared at the ruined dress with an expression of mild inconvenience. "Unfortunate," I repeated, my voice dangerously calm. "Someone sneaked into my room and slashed my wedding dress to pieces, Yvonne. Jasmine left a note." Yvonne finally turned to look at me, and her eyes were like frozen ponds. "Do not start pointing fingers, Kendra," she snapped. "You do not know what happened. Maybe it got caught in the hotel laundry machinery. Maybe a maid was careless. It does not matter now. We do not have time for you to throw a tantrum and make a scene today." I stared at her, completely repulsed by the woman standing in front of me. "You are actually defending her?" I asked. "She destroyed my wedding dress, Mother. She left a written confession pinned to the chest." Yvonne waved her hand, dismissing my words as if I were swatting a fly. "I said we do not have time for this, Kendra. Jasmine needs me in her suite for her final dress fitting. Her gown is incredibly complex, and she is very stressed about the photographers arriving. Preston's VIP guests are pulling up to the valet as we speak. We are hosting corporate titans and billionaire investors today. We cannot look like a fractured family. We need to project absolute unity and flawless wealth." She walked over to the closet and pulled out a plain beige sundress that I had worn to the airport 2 days ago. She tossed it onto the bed. "Just wear this," Yvonne instructed, pointing to the casual cotton dress. "You are getting married in a tent outside anyway. No one is going to expect high fashion in the humidity. Put on some decent makeup, smooth out your hair, and just get through the ceremony quickly. Be a team player for once in your life. Do not ruin this weekend for your sister by complaining about a dress." She checked her diamond watch and sighed again. "I have to go. Jasmine is waiting. Be down at the garden in 2 hours. And please, Kendra, try to smile. You always look so miserable and it reflects poorly on us." Yvonne turned on her heel and walked out of the bedroom. The suite door clicked shut and locked behind her. I stood in the absolute silence of the room. The air was heavy with the echo of her dismissal. My own mother had looked at the shredded remains of my wedding gown and told me to put on a travel sundress so I would not embarrass the family. It was the exact same thing she had done when I was 17, and she had taken the money I saved for my prom dress to buy Jasmine an outfit for a local beauty pageant. She had told me to wear an old skirt and smile. The pattern had never broken. It had only mutated into something infinitely more toxic. I walked over to the bed and picked up the beige sundress Yvonne had thrown at me. I looked at the cheap cotton fabric. I looked at the shredded white silk hanging on the mannequin. And then I smiled. It was a slow, terrifyingly serene smile. I dropped the sundress onto the floor and stepped directly over it. I walked to the far corner of the master bedroom, where a massive, heavy black steamer trunk sat untouched. It had been delivered the night before by a private courier service. My parents had assumed it was filled with standard luggage and cheap wedding supplies. They had completely ignored it. I knelt down in front of the trunk and entered the 6-digit numeric code into the reinforced steel locks. The heavy latches snapped open with a satisfying metallic clank. I lifted the lid. Nestled inside beneath layers of acid-free tissue paper and protective silk bags was the real dress. The shredded garment hanging on the mannequin was nothing but a $500 decoy. I had bought it off the rack at a discount bridal warehouse 3 months ago specifically for this purpose. I knew my sister. I knew her jealousy, her petty vindictiveness, and her desperate need to destroy anything that belonged to me. I knew that leaving a dress unguarded in a hotel room with Jasmine in the same building was like leaving raw meat in front of a starving wolf. She took the bait flawlessly, and my mother had reacted exactly as I predicted. I reached into the trunk and carefully lifted out a masterpiece. It was a breathtaking custom-made haute couture gown that I had flown in directly from a private atelier in Paris. The fabric was a luminous pearlescent ivory silk that cascaded like liquid light. The bodice was meticulously hand-embroidered with thousands of crushed pearls and microscopic Swarovski crystals that caught the morning sun and threw brilliant prismatic colors across the bedroom walls. It was a garment fit for a queen. It was a dress that screamed absolute unassailable power. It cost more than Desmond's entire logistics company was currently worth. I held the dress up against my body, looking at my reflection in the full-length mirror. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter in a ruined dress. I looked like the owner of Kingsley Holdings. I looked like a woman who was about to walk down the aisle and execute a flawless hostile takeover of her own family. I carefully hung the Parisian masterpiece on a velvet hanger. They wanted me in the background. They wanted me wearing a cheap sundress in a humid tent. They had no idea I was about to step into the sun and burn their entire fake empire to the ground. The cool, heavy silk of the Parisian gown slid over my skin like liquid armor. There was no frantic rushing, and there were no trembling hands. I moved through the quiet solitude of the master bedroom with the precise calculated grace of a woman preparing for war. I reached behind my back, pulling the hidden silk ties taut, feeling the internal corset cinch and lock perfectly against my ribs. The gown was a masterclass in architectural fashion. The bodice was structured and rigid, encrusted with thousands of microscopic Swarovski crystals that caught the morning sunlight and threw blinding shards of prismatic color across the walls. The skirt fell in a breathtaking sweep of luminous pearlescent ivory, pooling around my feet in a flawless heavy train. It was not a dress meant for a quiet garden ceremony. It was a garment designed to command a room, to dominate a space, and to completely eradicate anyone foolish enough to stand in its shadow. I stepped over the cheap beige sundress Yvonne had thrown onto the floor. I did not even spare a glance for the slashed ribbons of the decoy dress still hanging pitifully on the velvet mannequin. Jasmine thought she had broken me by destroying a piece of fabric. She thought my silence was submission. She had no idea that my silence was simply the oxygen being sucked out of the room before the explosion. I walked over to the sprawling marble vanity and sat down on the velvet bench. My face in the mirror was completely serene. My makeup was already flawless, sharp, and striking. I reached out and opened my heavy leather travel safe, revealing the custom velvet trays inside. Today I was not wearing borrowed family heirlooms. I was not wearing pieces passed down from a lineage that only saw me as a burden. Every single item I was about to put on my body represented a battle I had fought and won entirely on my own, while my family was busy betting against me. I picked up a pair of flawless 2-carat diamond solitaire earrings and secured them in place. They were cold against my skin. I bought them the morning I closed my first solo 9-figure acquisition in Manhattan. It was the exact same morning Desmond had called to tell me I was wasting my life in a hostile industry and that I should just move back home to do administrative work for his logistics company. He had told me I lacked the killer instinct to survive in private equity. He told me I was too soft. I wore these diamonds the day I gutted my first corporate rival and liquidated their assets. Next, I lifted a heavy, brilliant cut sapphire bracelet from the velvet tray. The deep ocean blue stones glittered under the vanity lights. I fastened the platinum clasp around my wrist, feeling its solid weight. This piece belonged to the memory of my mother. 5 years ago, Yvonne had cornered me at a holiday party, loudly mocking my lack of a romantic partner. She had gestured to Jasmine's wrist, which was weighed down by a flashy, gaudy bracelet bought with Desmond credit card. Yvonne had laughed and told the entire room that Kendra would never own nice things because she was too stubborn to find a man to buy them for her. I bought these sapphires in Geneva the day I was named a senior partner at Kingsley Holdings. I bought them with my own money because I did not need a man to finance my existence. I was my own provider. Finally, I reached for the centerpiece. A custom vintage Patek Philippe watch. It was sleek platinum and brutally elegant. I strapped it to my left wrist right next to the sapphires. This watch held the most delicious memory of all. I purchased it precisely 3 weeks ago. I bought it the exact hour my financial analyst finished auditing Preston Family Trust. I had sat in my corner office reading the forensic accounting reports that proved his real estate empire was nothing more than a hollow shell, propped up by toxic debt and fraudulent asset evaluations. I bought the watch to remind myself that time was running out for arrogant men who built their lives on lies. The second hand ticked against the silence of the suite, a steady, relentless countdown to Preston absolute destruction. My phone vibrated violently against the marble vanity, breaking the quiet stillness of the room. It was not another harassing message from my mother or a gloating text from my sister. The screen illuminated with a message from Malik. I unlocked the phone and opened our encrypted chat. Malik was standing ground zero in the lobby, acting as the silent observer to the spectacle downstairs. "The trap is completely full." Malik wrote his words, painting a vivid picture of the chaos unfolding below. "They swallowed the bait whole, Kendra. Preston and Jasmine have officially hijacked the grand ballroom. They locked the doors to the garden tent and diverted every single one of our wedding guests into their vow renewal pre-party." I kept my eyes on the screen, absorbing the tactical update. "Preston has his entire country club syndicate packed into the room," Malik continued in the next message. "He even hired a local society photographer to take press shots of his grand entrance. He is standing near the ice sculptures, bragging loudly to the mayor about his impending merger with Kingsley Holdings. Desmond is right beside him, acting like a glorified lapdog. Your father is actually introducing our Kingsley acquisition team to the crowd as his new junior partners. The sheer delusion is staggering. Yvonne is aggressively directing the catering staff, making sure everyone knows this is her daughter event. They think they have completely erased you from the schedule." I let out a slow, soft exhale. It was exactly as I had orchestrated. By pretending to surrender, I had given them enough rope to hang themselves in front of the most powerful people in the city. They had gathered all their wealthy friends, their vital business associates, and the local press into one confined space. They thought they were building a stage for Jasmine's crowning moment. They did not realize they had just constructed their own public execution block. "How do you want to play this?" Malik asked in his final message. "The orchestra is tuning up. Preston is about to take the microphone for his welcome speech. Give me the word, and I will lock the main doors from the inside." I tapped the screen, my manicured nails clicking sharply against the glass. "Let him take the microphone," I typed back. "Let him get the entire room attention. Do not lock the doors. Leave them wide open. I am coming down." I set the phone face down on the vanity and stood up. The heavy silk train of my gown whispered against the hardwood floor. I looked in the mirror one last time. There was no trace of the overlooked sister. There was no trace of the scapegoat daughter who had been pushed into the shadows her entire life. Staring back at me was the majority shareholder of Kingsley Holdings. Staring back at me was the woman who owned the very ground my family was currently dancing on. Just as I turned toward the suite doors, my phone rang. It was a sharp, piercing sound that shattered the remaining silence in the room. I did not need to check the caller identification. I knew exactly who was on the other end of the line. I picked up the device and pressed it to my ear. "Are you ready, Uncle Jeremiah?" I asked, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. A deep, commanding baritone voice rumbled through the speaker. Jeremiah Kingsley was a legend in the financial sector, a billionaire phantom who rarely showed his face in public. He was ruthless, brilliant, and terrifying to anyone who sat across from him at a negotiating table. But to me, he was the man who had recognized my fire 10 years ago. He was the mentor who had taught me how to weaponize my intellect. He was the surrogate father who had actually believed in me when my own blood had cast me aside. I was the founder of Kingsley Holdings, and he knew exactly what this day meant to me. "I am in the lobby," Kendra Jeremiah replied, his voice vibrating with absolute lethal authority. "The jet just landed and my security detail has secured the perimeter. Smooth out your dress and step onto the elevator. Let us go show these fools who really runs this city." Preston's feigned distress was a masterclass in narcissistic theater. He kept his hands planted on his hips, his tailored jacket pushed back, waiting for his audience to absorb the punchline of his little performance. The private dining room of Le Chateau, usually filled with the soft clinking of fine silver and the hushed, sophisticated murmurs of the city's elite, had descended into a thick, suffocating silence. The general manager stood frozen at Preston's elbow, his face a mask of trained professional neutrality, though his eyes darted nervously between the empty pockets of the supposed billionaire and the heavy leather folio resting on the table. Preston's wealthy country club associates, the men he had spent the last 2 hours trying to impress with tales of imaginary mergers and phantom wealth, began to chuckle. It started as a low, rumbling sound of amusement that quickly rippled down the sides of the table. They thought it was brilliant. They thought it was a tremendous display of alpha dominance to hijack a Michelin-starred rehearsal dinner order, the most expensive items in the cellar, and then stick the bill on the quiet, unassuming sister-in-law sitting at the far end of the room. I kept my hands resting gently on my lap, my posture perfectly straight. I did not break eye contact with Preston. I simply watched him with the clinical, detached fascination of a scientist, observing a particularly aggressive but ultimately doomed insect. Beside me, I could feel the heat radiating from Malik. My fiancé was entirely still, but it was the stillness of a coiled spring. His jaw was clenched so tightly that a muscle feathered dangerously along his cheekbone. He was ready to end the charade right then and there, ready to stand up and physically remove Preston from the room. I shifted my leg just a fraction beneath the table, letting my knee brush against his. My silent gesture carried a clear message. Let him dig the grave deeper. Sensing that the moment required a leading lady, Jasmine leaned forward. She adjusted the bodice of her white sequined gown, making sure the light from the crystal chandeliers caught the heavy, ostentatious diamonds resting against her collarbone. She let out a soft musical sigh, shaking her head with an expression of performative sympathy. She reached out and placed her perfectly manicured hand on the black leather folio. She did not even bother to open it to check the damage. She knew exactly what Preston had done, and she was entirely complicit in the extortion. With a slow, deliberate motion, Jasmine pushed the folio. It glided down the center of the long mahogany table, passing by empty bottles of vintage Dom Perignon and plates smeared with the remnants of imported caviar. The leather scraped softly against the polished wood, the sound loud in the quiet room, until it came to a gradual halt directly in front of my plate. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms and tilting her head. The triumphant, venomous smile on her face was a masterpiece of sibling rivalry. "Since you saved so much money downgrading your wedding to a tent, you can cover this," Jasmine announced, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. She projected her words perfectly, ensuring that every single investor, every waiter, and our parents heard her clearly. "Consider it a thank you for letting Dad focus on his favorite daughter." The room collectively held its breath. It was a brutal public execution of my dignity. I looked past the folio and locked eyes with my parents sitting just a few seats away from Jasmine. I expected at least a flicker of shame from Desmond. A momentary hesitation at watching his eldest daughter be financially extorted and verbally humiliated on the eve of her wedding. Instead, my father simply raised his glass of scotch, taking a long, slow sip, while staring at the wall, actively choosing cowardice over his own flesh and blood. Yvonne actually nodded, her lips curving into a tight, approving smile. In their twisted reality, Jasmine was merely asserting her rightful dominance, and I was fulfilling my lifelong purpose as the family shock absorber. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice, nor did I provide Preston and Jasmine with the dramatic, tearful outbursts they were so desperately trying to provoke. I simply reached forward and opened the leather folio. The final total was printed in bold, unforgiving black ink at the bottom of the itemized receipt: $25, $450. It was a staggering, astronomical amount of money for a single dinner. It was a sum that would have bankrupted the average family, a sum that represented months of grueling labor for most of the working-class staff standing nervously around the perimeter of the room. Preston had intentionally tried to bleed me dry, assuming that a bill this large would force me to publicly admit I could not afford it, thereby completing my absolute humiliation in front of his elite circle. I did not flinch. I did not sigh. I simply reached into my small satin clutch and withdrew a solid, unmarked black metal card. I placed it onto the silver tray inside the folio. I looked up, catching the eye of the general manager, who had hurried down the length of the table to stand beside my chair. He looked incredibly apologetic, his eyes conveying a silent sympathy for the extortion I was enduring. "Please run this for the full amount," I instructed, my voice echoing clearly in the quiet room. "And I need you to do me a specific favor. When you bring the receipt, I need an explicitly detailed corporate tax invoice. Please ensure the business identification numbers are clearly marked on the final printout." The manager bowed deeply, expressing his gratitude with a hushed voice, before taking the folio and rushing out of the room to process the transaction. Preston threw his head back and let out a loud, mocking bark of laughter. He clapped his hands together, pointing down the table at me, as if I were the punchline to the greatest joke he had ever heard. "A corporate tax receipt!" Preston practically shouted, wiping a fake tear of mirth from his eye. "Oh, that is rich. You hear that, guys? Kendra needs to write off this dinner for her little freelance gig." He began to pace behind his chair, playing directly to his audience of investors. "What are you going to categorize this under? Sweetheart office supplies, client entertainment for your little startup? I mean, I get it," he continued, his tone dripping with heavy, suffocating condescension. "When you are hustling from paycheck to paycheck, you have to find those loopholes. You have to scrape and claw for every single tax deduction you can find, just to keep the lights on in whatever co-working space you rent." The sycophantic laughter from his country club friends swelled, filling the room with ugly, arrogant noise. "It is cute, really. It shows initiative," Preston sneered, leaning his knuckles against the mahogany table and staring at me. "Maybe when my family's merger is complete next week, I can hire you to run our social media accounts. Give you a real steady paycheck so you do not have to panic and ask for tax receipts over a simple dinner bill." Jasmine giggled, leaning into Yvonne. "She always was so dramatic about money," Jasmine stage whispered, entirely intentionally. "Acting like she is a CEO just because she registered an LLC online." I sat in perfect, motionless silence. I let the mockery wash over me, absorbing every insult, every condescending laugh, every cruel remark. They were so blinded by their own arrogance, so convinced of their superiority, that they could not see the massive shadow of the guillotine hanging directly over their necks. They believed wealth was loud. They believed power was standing at the head of a table and making others feel small. They had no idea that real power was quiet. Real power was owning the table, the restaurant, and the very ground they were standing on. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room opened, and the general manager returned. The room quieted slightly as he approached my seat, the soft thud of his shoes cutting through the lingering chuckles of Preston's associates. He carried a silver tray holding my heavy black metal card and a long, pristine printed receipt. He did not look at Preston. He looked only at me, offering a deep, respectful nod as he presented the tray. "The transaction was approved instantly, ma'am," the manager said quietly, though his words carried a distinct, heavy weight. And the corporate tax invoice has been prepared exactly to your specifications. Thank you for your patronage. I picked up the black card and slipped it back into my clutch. Then I picked up the detailed corporate receipt. It was a long, itemized list of Preston's unbridled gluttony, detailing the vintage Dom Perignon, the imported Wagyu, and the beluga caviar. I did not even glance at the $25,000 total again. I simply turned slightly in my chair and held the piece of paper out to Malik. The dining room was hushed, now the guests watching with collective curiosity. They expected me to tuck the receipt away, to shrink back into the shadows, and lick my wounds, like the defeated sister-in-law I was supposed to be. Instead, I kept my hand extended toward my fiancé. I looked past Malik, locking my gaze directly onto Preston, who was still standing at the head of the table with his arms crossed and a smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. File this under Kingsley Holdings Acquisitions Department, I said. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, chilling authority of an apex predator, snapping the trap shut. I made sure my enunciation was flawless, ensuring that the name echoed off the mahogany panels and the crystal chandeliers carrying perfectly to every single corner of the room. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The smug, arrogant grin on Preston's face vanished, instantly wiped away, as if he had been struck by a physical blow. His arms dropped heavily to his sides. The blood drained from his cheeks so rapidly that his skin took on a sickly, translucent gray pallor. His eyes widened, darting from the receipt in my hand to my face, his brain scrambling to process the sheer impossibility of what I had just said. Kingsley Holdings, the very same legendary private equity firm he had just spent 20 minutes bragging about to the entire room. The firm he claimed was merging with his family's failing real estate empire. The firm he thought was his ultimate salvation. Preston's mouth opened, but no sound came out. A collective sharp gasp rippled through his table of investors, the wealthy connected men who actually understood the gravity of that corporate name. They stared at me, their expressions shifting from condescending amusement to stark, unfiltered terror. "K. Kingsley," Preston stammered, his voice cracking, completely devoid of its previous booming arrogance. He took a stumbling step forward, his hands gripping the edge of the table to steady himself as his knees visibly weakened. A sheen of nervous sweat suddenly broke out across his forehead, shining under the chandelier light. "Wait, what do you mean, Kingsley Holdings? How do you—" I did not give him the satisfaction of an explanation. I did not stay to answer his panicked, breathless questions, or watch him drown in the sudden crushing realization of his own ruin. I smoothly stood up from my chair, smoothing the skirt of my dress. Malik stood instantly beside me. His broad shoulders squared, a slow, predatory smile finally spreading across his handsome face. He took the receipt from my hand and tucked it neatly into the inside pocket of his tailored jacket. Without another word, without looking at my parents or Jasmine, I turned my back on the entire room. Malik placed a protective, warm hand on the small of my back, and together we walked toward the heavy oak doors. Behind me, the silence of the room was broken only by the sound of Preston's ragged, panicked breathing. We stepped out of the private dining room and into the cool, quiet hallway, leaving the arrogant heir to a crumbling empire, sweating under the crushing weight of a trap he had walked into, completely blind. The elevator doors glided open with a soft chime, revealing the sprawling marble expanse of the resort's main lobby. I stepped out, the heavy pearlescent ivory silk of my Parisian gown flowing flawlessly behind me. The intricate bodice, woven with thousands of microscopic Swarovski crystals, caught the ambient light, casting a brilliant, blinding glow across the polished stone walls. I did not look like a woman whose wedding had just been stolen. I looked like a woman who owned the building. Standing near the grand arched entrance to the ballroom hallway was Jeremiah Kingsley. How was a phantom in the financial sector? A man whose name struck fear into the hearts of Wall Street executives, yet whose face was rarely photographed. At 62, the legendary African-American billionaire possessed a physical presence that demanded absolute submission. He wore a bespoke, razor-sharp charcoal suit that draped perfectly over his broad frame. His posture was impeccable, his silver-flecked hair immaculately groomed, and his dark eyes carried the ruthless, calculating intelligence that had built an empire from the ground up. He was my mentor, my confidant, and the only man who had ever looked at my intellect and seen a weapon rather than a liability. Jeremiah turned as he heard the rustle of my silk train. A slow, deeply approving smile spread across his stern face. He extended his right arm toward me. "You look exactly like the apex predator I trained you to be, Kendra," Jeremiah said, his deep baritone voice vibrating with quiet pride. "I had an excellent teacher," I replied, sliding my gloved hand gracefully into the crook of his arm. "Are we ready to execute the final phase?" "The board is set," Jeremiah confirmed, his gaze shifting toward the heavy oak double doors of the grand ballroom at the end of the corridor. "Let us go show these parasites what real power looks like." Inside the grand ballroom, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick with manufactured grandeur and unearned arrogance. Jasmine stood at the center of the elevated altar, soaking in the rapt attention of the room. She was draped in her overly embellished sequined white gown, her posture stiff with the desperate need to be the center of the universe. Preston stood beside her, grinning like a conquering king, completely oblivious to the fact that the receipt I had handed Malik 20 minutes earlier had already sealed his financial tomb. The ballroom was packed to capacity, with Preston's wealthy elite country club family and Desmond's high society business associates. It was a sea of pastel designer dresses, tailored linen suits, and inherited entitlement. They had completely abandoned the garden tent, happily complicit in hijacking the space I had meticulously designed and paid for. Desmond was in his absolute element. My father was practically glowing, playing the role of the proud, magnanimous patriarch. He moved through the front row with a wide, artificial smile, shaking hands and aggressively networking. He clapped Preston's father, a notoriously arrogant real estate developer, firmly on the shoulder. Desmond was introducing himself to men he foolishly believed were his new junior partners. He had no idea that the sharp, observant men in the front row were actually Kingsley Holdings acquisition executives, men who worked directly for me, attending only to oversee the final liquidation of Preston's family assets. The conductor raised his baton. The orchestral music suddenly swelled, filling the cavernous ballroom with the grand, sweeping chords of a traditional bridal entrance. Jasmine beamed, adjusting her veil, expecting the crowd to rise and applaud her orchestrated moment of glory. She waited for the photographers to flash their bulbs, waiting for the validation she had stolen from me. Instead, the heavy 12-foot solid oak doors at the back of the ballroom swung open with a deafening, violent thud. The heavy wood slammed against the brass wall, stops the sound echoing like a gunshot over the swelling orchestral music. The conductor flinched, his baton dropping. The music abruptly faltered, dissolving into a chaotic, discordant screech of violins and cellos before dying out completely. Every single head in the grand ballroom snapped toward the back entrance. I stood perfectly still in the center of the massive doorway, framed by the blinding afternoon sunlight pouring in from the lobby windows behind me. The Parisian haute couture gown was a breathtaking spectacle, the crushed pearls and crystals illuminating the dim room. I did not look like the scapegoat daughter arriving late to her own ruined wedding. I looked like royalty descending upon a peasant uprising, but it was not the dress that caused the oxygen to instantly vanish from the room. It was not my flawless makeup or the cold, serene expression on my face. It was the man holding my arm. A shockwave of recognition ripped through the front rows of the ballroom. The wealthy elite, the corporate sharks, and the high society investors immediately realized who was standing in the doorway. Preston's father, who had been mid-laugh, suddenly choked violently on his premium bourbon. He coughed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson, his eyes bulging out of his head as he stared at the entrance. The Kingsley acquisition executives sitting in the front row immediately stood up in unison, buttoning their jackets and standing at absolute attention out of sheer unfiltered respect for their boss. The room fell deathly, paralyzingly silent. The murmurs began to spread like a wildfire through dry brush. Is that Jeremiah Kingsley? What is the CEO of Kingsley Holdings doing here? Why is he walking Desmond's other daughter down the aisle? Jasmine's triumphant smile shattered. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, unfiltered rage and confusion. She gripped Preston's arm, her knuckles turning white, realizing in a fraction of a second that her stolen spotlight had just been utterly hijacked and completely obliterated. Preston looked as though he was going to vomit, the color draining from his face, as his eyes darted from the receipt still burning a hole in his memory, to the billionaire titan standing at the back of the room. Jeremiah patted my hand once. We stepped forward, our shoes moving in perfect synchronized rhythm against the pristine white aisle runner. We did not rush. We walked with the slow, deliberate pacing of executioners approaching the block. The sea of guests parted, holding their collective breath, their eyes glued to the impossible sight of the city's most elusive billionaire walking the family outcast down the aisle. Desmond dropped his glossy ceremony program. The heavy cardstock hit the floor with a soft slap, my father's brain visibly short-circuited. He looked at me in the Parisian gown, then looked at the titan of industry holding my arm. Desmond's desperate sycophantic instincts completely overrode his basic common sense. He fundamentally misunderstood the situation, assuming Jeremiah had arrived to bless the union of Preston's family or to finalize the phantom merger. Desmond scrambled out of the front pew, sweating profusely through his tailored suit jacket. He rushed down the center aisle, his arms extended, intercepting our path halfway to the altar. He blocked the aisle, forcing Jeremiah and me to a halt. "Mr. Kingsley, sir." Desmond gasped, his voice trembling with a sickening mixture of shock, awe, and desperate subservience. He bowed his head slightly, attempting to grab Jeremiah's free hand to shake it. "What an absolute honor! We had no idea you were coming. But sir, I must apologize for the confusion. You are walking with Kendra, but this is actually my daughter Jasmine's vow renewal. The merger celebration with Preston's family." Desmond smiled weakly, gesturing toward the altar where Jasmine was vibrating with fury. My father looked at me with a sharp, warning glare, silently commanding me to step aside and stop embarrassing the family in front of a billionaire. Jeremiah Kingsley did not take my father's extended hand. He did not even acknowledge the gesture. Jeremiah simply looked down at Desmond. It was a look of pure, unadulterated ice. It was the look a man gives a cockroach before bringing down the heel of his shoe. The temperature in the immediate vicinity seemed to drop 20 degrees. Jeremiah's deep, commanding voice rolled over the dead silence of the ballroom, carrying effortlessly to the cheap seats in the back. "I am not here for a vow renewal," Jeremiah stated, his tone dripping with lethal, crushing authority. "And I am certainly not here to celebrate a fictitious merger with a bankrupt family." Desmond's outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. The color vanished from my father's face. "I am here," Jeremiah continued, projecting his voice so every single person in the room heard the absolute truth, "to walk my co-founder and majority shareholder down the aisle." The silence that followed was deafening. It was the sound of an entire family's false reality shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I felt a profound, beautiful sense of peace wash over me as I watched my father's eyes widen in absolute terror. His mind finally connecting the dots he had been too arrogant to see for the past 10 years. Jeremiah took one step forward, forcing Desmond to physically shrink back. "Now step aside, Desmond," Jeremiah ordered, his eyes narrowing into deadly slits. "Before I make a single phone call and collect the $10 million toxic debt you owe my company." The blood completely vanished from Desmond's face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. The $10 million toxic debt was his deepest, darkest secret, the very reason he had been bending over backward to appease Preston's family in the first place. He had spent months secretly shifting assets and cooking the books of his logistics company, desperate to hide the gaping hole in his finances. He looked from Jeremiah Kingsley's unyielding, terrifying glare to my perfectly composed, serene face. His mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish pulled straight from the harbor. He took a stumbling step backward, his polished shoes squeaking awkwardly against the pristine white aisle runner. Complete chaos erupted in the grand ballroom. The hushed, confused whispers of the high society guests exploded into a frantic, deafening cacophony of panicked voices. The elite attendees shifted uncomfortably in their mahogany chairs, their eyes darting wildly between the altar and the center aisle. Whispers of Kingsley Holdings and the sheer scale of the wealth involved bounced off the acoustic panels. Jasmine was practically vibrating with rage at the altar. her knuckles completely white as she gripped her expensive cascading bouquet so tightly that the fragile stems snapped, dropping bruised white rose petals onto the marble floor. Preston could not process the humiliation. His fragile ego, inflated by years of inherited wealth and unearned, unchecked arrogance, finally shattered under the weight of the moment. He marched down the velvet-carpeted steps of the altar, his face a violent mottled shade of crimson. He shoved past Desmond, storming right up to where Jeremiah and I stood. Preston tried to puff out his chest, attempting to physically intimidate us with his height. Next to Jeremiah's imposing battle-tested frame and my icy, statuesque stillness, Preston looked like nothing more than an angry, petulant child throwing a tantrum because his favorite toy had been taken away. "What kind of sick, pathetic prank is this?" Preston demanded, spit flying from his lips as he shouted. He pointed a shaking, manicured finger directly at my face. "You think you can just hire some elderly actor off the street to walk you in here and ruin my special day? You think you can throw out corporate buzzwords and scare me? I am a Preston. We own half the commercial real estate in this city. You are nothing but a failed freelancer playing dress-up in a rented gown." Jeremiah did not even blink. He did not flinch, nor did he offer Preston the basic respect of a verbal response. The billionaire simply adjusted his platinum cufflinks with agonizing, deliberate precision. He treated Preston like an annoying gnat buzzing pointlessly around a lion. The sheer indifference radiating from my mentor was more devastating than any shouted insult could ever be. Realizing he was getting absolutely nowhere with us, Preston whipped around and turned his unfiltered fury onto my father. He lunged forward and grabbed Desmond by the lapels of his expensive Italian suit, shaking the older man roughly. "Fix this right now, Desmond!" Preston roared, the veins bulging prominently in his neck, completely abandoning his polished, sophisticated country club persona in front of hundreds of shocked witnesses. "If you do not get this absolute embarrassment out of my sight, this exact second, my family is pulling our $5 million investment from your logistics company today. We will ruin you. We will bankrupt your entire pathetic operation by morning." Desmond panicked. The threat of total financial ruin stripped away whatever remaining shred of parental loyalty he possessed. He threw his hands up in a gesture of absolute surrender to Preston, turning to me with wild, pleading, desperate eyes. He was ready to throw me under the bus again. He was entirely prepared to sacrifice his eldest daughter to the wolves just to save his own miserable skin and keep his failing company afloat for a few more months. He opened his mouth, drawing a breath, to order me out of the room, to beg Preston for forgiveness on bended knee. I did not give him the chance to speak. I released Jeremiah's arm and took one deliberate, measured step forward. The heavy, luxurious silk of my gown rustled loudly in the sudden, tense silence that had fallen over the immediate vicinity. I walked right past my father, completely ignoring his pathetic, whimpering presence, and stopped at the very base of the altar. I squared my shoulders and looked Preston dead in the eye. He tried to hold my gaze. He tried to maintain his furious, dominant facade, jutting his chin out and glaring down at me. But I saw the raw, unmistakable terror flickering wildly behind his eyes. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, and he could feel the wood beginning to splinter beneath his expensive leather shoes. "You cannot invest anything, Preston," I said, my voice smooth, melodic, and cold. The acoustics of the ballroom carried my words perfectly, echoing through the silent, captivated space. Preston froze, his chest heaving rapidly as he tried to process my words. He let out a harsh, derisive bark of laughter, looking back at his country club friends for support. He expected them to join in to laugh at the delusional woman standing before him. The front row was dead silent. His friends, the men he had been desperate to impress, were staring at me with dawning, unadulterated horror. They were seasoned businessmen. They had recognized Jeremiah Kingsley immediately, and they realized that a woman walking on the arm of a man who controlled billions in liquid capital did not make empty, dramatic threats. They understood the terrifying reality of the situation long before Preston did. "What the hell are you talking about, you crazy batch?" Preston sneered, though his voice notably lacked its previous booming volume, dropping into a defensive, wavering register. "My family's trust is worth hundreds of millions. I can crush your pathetic little startup with a single phone call. I can buy and sell you 10 times over." I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp curve of my lips that held absolutely no warmth, a smile forged in the fires of late-night audits and ruthless corporate acquisitions. Your family's real estate firm filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy on Thursday afternoon, I announced. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable resonated clearly across the vast room, burying the truth deep into his chest. Your toxic assets finally outweighed your fraudulent property evaluations. The major banks called in your commercial loans, the creditors circled the wagons, and your father realized he was drowning. So he desperately looked for a lifeline. He blindly reached out to the biggest player in the market. He found Kingsley Holdings. I took another step closer, lowering my voice, just a fraction, forcing him to lean in slightly to hear the specific details of his own absolute destruction. Kingsley Holdings bought your debt for pennies on the dollar, Preston. The grand historic merger you have been bragging about all morning to these people, the glorious union of our two families, to save your crumbling empire and elevate your social status. It does not exist. It never existed. It was a hostile takeover from the very beginning. We did not merge with your firm. We consumed it. We stripped it for parts. You do not have a $5 million investment to pull from my father's logistics company, because you do not have $5 to your name. You are completely irrevocably broke. The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the kind of heavy, suffocating, vacuum-sealed quiet that precedes a massive, catastrophic explosion. That is a lie! Jasmine shrieked from the top of the altar. She hiked up the front of her heavy sequined skirt and stomped down the marble steps, violently inserting herself between Preston and me. Her face was twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unfiltered denial. Her carefully sprayed curls bounced wildly around her face. She grabbed Preston's arm, shaking it with frantic energy. "Tell her it is a lie, Preston. Tell them she is just jealous." Jasmine screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. "She is making it up. She is just trying to ruin my moment because no one loves her. Tell them you are rich." Preston did not answer her. His mouth hung slightly open, his jaw slack. He slowly turned his head away from me, looking past the row of stone-faced Kingsley executives to where his own father sat at the end of the aisle. The elder Preston had not moved to defend his son. He had not stood up to shout down my accusations. He was slumped forward in his ornate wooden chair, his face buried deep in his trembling hands. His broad shoulders shook with silent, defeated, agonizing sobs. He did not need to say a single word. His absolute crushing surrender confirmed everything I had just exposed. He had kept the bankruptcy a strict secret from his arrogant, careless son, hoping against hope to use this sham of a wedding as a high society networking event to secure emergency funding from Desmond's associates. He had failed completely, and now his family's ruin was public spectacle. Jasmine saw her father-in-law's devastated reaction and let out a piercing, hysterical scream. The reality of the situation crashed down on her shoulders. She turned her rage entirely onto me, her eyes wild and bloodshot with panic as she watched her imaginary billionaire lifestyle, her guaranteed luxury, and her ultimate victory over me evaporate into thin air. "Get her out of here!" Jasmine shrieked, stamping her foot furiously on the marble floor like a toddler denied a toy. She turned to Desmond, grabbing his sleeve and pulling at the fabric. "Dad, make her leave. She ruined my day. Throw her out. She cannot be here. Call security." Desmond just stared at me in paralyzed, trembling shock. The gears in his head had finally locked into place. Understanding that the daughter he had treated as a scapegoat, the daughter he had cast aside and belittled for her entire life, was the only one holding the keys to his financial survival. He remained entirely mute, his throat tight with fear, terrified that speaking a single syllable would provoke Jeremiah into calling in his massive company-destroying debts. I looked at Jasmine, watching her hyperventilate in her gaudy dress, her face streaked with ruined mascara, and felt nothing but cold, clinical, highly satisfying closure. I raised my right hand, lifting it gracefully into the air, and snapped my fingers once. It was a sharp, crisp sound that cut right through Jasmine's hysterical, unbroken sobbing. Instantly, the general manager of Le Chateau stepped forward from the dark shadows of the hallway entrance. He was flanked by 4 massive, heavily built private security guards wearing dark tactical suits and discreet earpieces. They marched down the center aisle, their heavy boots moving in perfect intimidating unison, completely ignoring the horrified whispering stares of the wealthy guests. The general manager stopped directly in front of Preston and Jasmine. He did not offer his usual polite subservient bow. He reached into his tailored jacket pocket and pulled out a thick, legally sealed document bearing the bold official red stamp of the city court. He thrust it directly into Preston's shaking, sweaty hands. Jasmine stared at the heavy manila envelope, her breathing ragged and shallow. She looked from the imposing, unsmiling security guards to the stoic manager, her mind unable to comprehend the sheer speed of her downfall. "What is this?" Jasmine shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic as she pointed a shaking acrylic nail at the envelope. I smiled, letting the absolute finality of my victory settle over the room like a heavy winter frost. "It is an eviction notice," I said smoothly. The general manager of Le Chateau stepped forward, standing with the perfect, rigid posture of a man who understood exactly where true power resided. He held the heavy manila envelope with both hands, presenting it not as a simple document, but as a formal declaration of ruin. Preston snatched the envelope, his hands trembling so violently that the paper rattled against his palms. He tore the seal, pulling out the thick stack of legal documents. His eyes frantically darted across the pages, searching for a loophole, a mistake, anything that would save him from the suffocating reality closing in around his throat. Jasmine peered over his shoulder, her chest heaving, her perfectly styled curls shaking with her erratic, panicked breathing. She could not comprehend the legal jargon, but the bold red stamps and the official city court seals were universally understood. The general manager turned his attention to the wider room, raising his voice so it carried effortlessly over the sudden, stunned silence of the gathered elite. "As of 9 o'clock this morning," the general manager announced, his voice ringing with absolute practiced clarity, "Ms. Kendra finalized the outright purchase of this entire resort property through Kingsley Holdings. She is now the sole owner of Le Chateau. Furthermore, our records indicate that neither the Preston family nor the Desmond family have submitted payment for the use of the grand ballroom today." A sharp collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The wealthy country club associates who had just spent hours drinking top-tier champagne and eating imported caviar on Preston's non-existent dime suddenly realized they were sitting in a hijacked room eating stolen food. Therefore, the general manager continued, entirely unfazed by the growing panic, "Ms. Kendra has requested that you and your non-paying guests vacate the grand ballroom immediately so her scheduled wedding can commence." The words hung in the air, heavy and lethal. Jasmine let out a sound that was half shriek, half sob. She grabbed the fabric of Preston's jacket, yanking him aggressively. She demanded that he do something, that he pull out his wallet, that he call his bank. Preston just stood there, staring blankly at the eviction notice, completely paralyzed by the realization that he was a bankrupt fraud standing in a room owned by the woman he had just tried to publicly extort. Realizing that her supposed billionaire fiancé was entirely useless, Jasmine whipped her head around and locked her wild, tear-filled eyes on our parents. She lunged toward Desmond, her heavy sequined skirt catching on the marble steps as she stumbled down the altar. "Dad, do something!" Jasmine screamed, her voice cracking, completely abandoning any pretense of high society elegance. "Pay the bill, write her a check, tell her to get out of my room. You cannot let her do this to me." Desmond remained frozen in the center aisle. My father's mind was racing, the gears grinding violently as his entire worldview shattered and restructured itself in a matter of seconds. He looked at Jasmine, his precious golden child, the daughter he had groomed for high society greatness. She was hysterical, her makeup running, married to a man whose family was deeply toxically bankrupt. Preston could offer no investments, no mergers, and no financial salvation. Then Desmond slowly turned his head to look at me. I stood at the base of the altar, draped in Parisian silk, flanked by a legendary billionaire and a team of private security guards. I was the majority shareholder of the firm that now owned his $10 million debt. I was the woman holding the absolute power of life and death over his logistics company. I was not the family scapegoat anymore. I was the executioner. Survival instinct is a ruthless, ugly thing. In that singular moment, Desmond did the math, and he violently, seamlessly pivoted. He physically turned his back on Jasmine. He ignored her reaching, grasping hands and her hysterical sobs. He took a wide, eager step toward me, his face splitting into a wide, sweaty, utterly sickening smile. He opened his arms, presenting himself as the loving, proud patriarch attempting to pull me into a tight embrace. "Kendra, my brilliant girl," Desmond announced, his voice practically vibrating with fake, desperate affection. He spoke loudly, ensuring Jeremiah Kingsley and the acquisition executives in the front row heard his display of fatherly pride. "I always knew you were special. I always knew you had the fire to succeed. This was all just a test, sweetheart. We just wanted to push you to reach your full potential. Let us just forgive and forget, keep the family together. We can celebrate your amazing success right now." Yvonne did not miss a beat. My mother, sensing the massive shift in power, abandoned her seat in the front pew and hurried to stand beside Desmond. She completely threw Jasmine to the wolves without a single second of hesitation. "Your sister has always been so difficult and greedy," Yvonne said, her voice dripping with sudden, venomous disdain for her former favorite child. She clasped her hands together, looking at me with wide, pleading eyes. "She forced us into this, Kendra. You know how demanding Jasmine can be. She manipulated your father and me. We never wanted to exclude you. You are our brilliant, successful daughter. Please let us just move past this ugliness." The sheer, unfiltered hypocrisy of their words was almost suffocating. They stood before me completely willing to erase decades of emotional abuse, neglect, and financial manipulation just to save their own comfortable lifestyles. They expected me to simply fold back into the family dynamic, to eagerly accept their conditional transactional love now that my net worth had skyrocketed. They thought I was still the desperate, overlooked girl craving her parents' approval. I looked at my father's open arms. I looked at my mother's fake, pleading smile. I felt the comforting, solid warmth of Malik standing right behind my shoulder, and the quiet, imposing presence of Jeremiah Kingsley waiting for my command. I took a slow, deliberate step backward. Desmond's arms dropped slightly, his sweaty smile faltering as he realized I was not moving into his embrace. The room was so quiet that the soft rustle of my silk gown sounded like thunder. I looked down at the cascading white bouquet in my hands, adjusting a single orchid with clinical precision before lifting my gaze back to the people who shared my blood but had never been my family. "I learned everything about business from you, Dad," I said. My voice was completely devoid of emotion. It was cold, flat, and absolute. Desmond swallowed hard, trying to maintain his encouraging smile, nodding eagerly, as if expecting a compliment. "You taught me that dead weight needs to be cut loose." I continued, staring directly into his terrified eyes. "You taught me that bad investments must be liquidated. You taught me that you never throw good money after a toxic asset." I shifted my gaze to Yvonne, who flinched physically under my icy stare, and then to Jasmine, who was currently weeping loudly on the floor near the front pew. "And you three," I said, my voice cutting through the silent ballroom like a freshly sharpened blade, "are the heaviest dead weight I carry." Desmond gasped, taking a stumbling step back, as if I had struck him across the face. The remaining color completely drained from his cheeks. Yvonne covered her mouth with her hand, a genuine, terrified sob escaping her lips. They finally understood that there would be no reconciliation. There would be no forgiveness. There would be no financial bailout for the logistics company, and there would be no seat at the table in my new empire. I turned my head slightly, catching the eye of the lead security guard standing near Preston. "Escort them out," I commanded quietly. "All of them." The security team moved with terrifying professional efficiency. The guard stepped forward, physically separating Preston, Jasmine, and my parents from the rest of the stunned guests. Jasmine completely lost whatever remaining shred of sanity she possessed. She threw a full hysterical tantrum right there on the pristine white aisle runner. She dropped to her knees, thrashing wildly, screaming at the top of her lungs about how unfair the world was, how I was ruining her life, and how she demanded to be treated like a bride. Her frantic movements caught the heavy sequined hem of her ostentatious gown under her own heel, causing the cheap fabric to rip loudly. Her carefully applied makeup ran down her face in dark, ugly streaks. The security guards did not flinch. Two of them simply grabbed her by the upper arms and hoisted her off the floor, physically dragging her kicking and screaming down the center aisle. Preston did not fight back. The former heir to a real estate dynasty was utterly broken. He kept his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in absolute defeat as a guard marched him toward the exit. He had to walk past the front rows filled with his elite peers, the country club associates he had tried to impress, who now turned their faces away in disgust and secondhand embarrassment. He was completely humiliated, stripped of his unearned arrogance and his fake billionaire status. Desmond and Yvonne were marched out right behind them. My father was practically hyperventilating, begging over his shoulder, pleading with Jeremiah Kingsley, pleading with the acquisition executives, and finally desperately pleading with me for a second chance that he knew would never come. Yvonne was weeping, openly clinging to Desmond's arm as they were paraded past their high society friends. In the span of 30 minutes, they had been entirely stripped of their social standing, their financial security, and their pride. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off Jasmine's hysterical shrieks. The toxic elements were finally gone. The heavy, suffocating atmosphere of manufactured grandeur and familial abuse evaporated with them, leaving the grand ballroom feeling suddenly vast, clean, and filled with brilliant natural light. A ballroom full of stunned, silent guests remained. The sycophants and the country club elite who had laughed at me earlier were now shifting uncomfortably in their seats, terrified of drawing my attention, acutely aware that they were sitting in a room owned by the woman they had just mocked. I did not care about them. I turned away from the crowd and faced Malik. My fiancé was standing right where he had been the entire time, his hands clasped casually in front of him. A slow, incredibly proud, deeply loving smirk was spread across his handsome face. He looked at me with an expression of pure reverence, his dark eyes shining with admiration for the way I had flawlessly executed the trap. I took a deep breath, letting the tension bleed out of my shoulders. A genuine radiant smile broke across my face. "I believe we have a wedding to attend," I said softly. Malik chuckled, offering me his arm. "It is about time, Mrs. Kingsley." The resort staff immediately sprang into action. The general manager, having anticipated this exact sequence of events, discreetly signaled his team. Dozens of highly trained staff members flooded the room through the side service doors. They moved with incredible speed, dismantling the tacky, over-the-top floral arrangements Preston's family had demanded, and replacing them with the elegant, understated white orchids and deep green foliage I had originally selected. The gaudy ice sculptures were rolled away, and the lighting was softened to a warm, romantic glow. While the staff flipped the room, the security team politely but firmly escorted Preston's remaining country club associates out of the building. The room quickly emptied of the fake friends, the corporate sharks, and the high society gossips. The only people left in the grand ballroom were the people who truly mattered. Malik's family, who had watched the entire spectacle with quiet, supportive dignity, moved up to fill the front pews. My actual friends, the colleagues who had supported me during the grueling early days of my career, took their seats with joyous smiles. Jeremiah Kingsley stepped forward again, offering me his arm one final time. The orchestra, having recovered from the earlier shock, began to play a soft, beautiful, sweeping melody that filled the massive room with warmth and grace. We walked down the aisle together. There was no anxiety, no dread, and no looming shadow of my family's conditional love. There was only the future. Jeremiah stopped at the altar, placing my hand gently into Malik's. He gave my fiancé a stern, approving nod before stepping back to take his seat in the front row. The ceremony was perfectly intimate, profoundly beautiful, and entirely on my own terms. We exchanged the vows we had written for each other, speaking softly in the quiet, supportive space. When Malik finally kissed me, the applause from our genuine friends and family echoed loudly off the high ceilings, a sound of true, unfiltered joy. I had finally received the celebration I deserved, completely free from the suffocating shadow of my sister and the endless toxic expectations of my parents. Hours later, the reception was in full swing. The ballroom had been transformed into a lively, energetic celebration. The music was loud, the champagne was flowing freely, and the dance floor was packed. I stepped away from the crowd for a moment, needing to catch my breath. I walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the resort's sprawling front circular driveway. Outside, the weather had turned. A heavy, relentless rain was pouring down from the dark evening sky, slicking the pavement and reflecting the orange glow of the street lamps. I stood in my flawless silk gown, holding a crystal flute of vintage champagne, and looked down at the parking lot. A heavy-duty commercial tow truck was currently backing up toward Preston's highly prized, excessively expensive luxury sports car. The flashing yellow lights of the tow truck cut through the pouring rain. Standing right in the middle of the downpour was Preston, his tailored suit completely ruined, aggressively waving his arms and shouting at the tow truck driver. The driver simply handed him a clipboard with the repossession paperwork. Jasmine was standing on the curb under the awning of the resort, shivering in her torn, wet sequined dress. She was screaming at Preston, her voice completely lost to the sound of the heavy rain, furious that her ride home was being actively repossessed by the bank. Standing, just a few feet away, huddled together near a stone pillar, to avoid the worst of the rain, were Desmond and Yvonne. They looked utterly defeated, physically diminished by the reality of their new existence. Their country club facade was shattered forever. They were waiting for a cheap rideshare car to take them back to a logistics company that would likely be seized by Kingsley Holdings before the end of the fiscal quarter. I watched the tow truck lift the luxury car into the air and pull away into the stormy night, leaving Preston standing alone in the rain. I felt a warm presence step up behind me. Malik slipped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder as he looked out the window at the miserable scene below. "Enjoying the view," he murmured, pressing a soft kiss to my neck. I smiled, taking a slow, satisfying sip of the crisp champagne. I turned around in his arms, looking up at the man who had stood by my side through it all. "Revenge isn't just sweet," I whispered, pulling him in for a kiss. "It's highly profitable. True power doesn't come from seeking validation from those who consistently tear you down. The most profound lesson here is that you cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from toxic blood ties and quietly build your own empire. Your worth is never defined by a family's inability to see it, but by your own relentless resilience. Real family is chosen built on mutual respect and unwavering support." Have you ever had to set hard boundaries to protect your peace? Share your story in the comments below and subscribe for more.